All right, we are live. Okay, so we are here today to debate animal welfare. And there's not a proposition, but we will probably get a handful of them going. Or actually, Brandon has a proposition that everybody can respond to their thought on the proposition, and I'll let him mention that. But just to start it off, we got Pablo here and Brandon, Logical Consistency, are both going to be on the pro-animal welfare side. Got Lewis and Eric, who will be on the anti-animal welfare side. All four of them are vegan, unless I'm wrong about that, and then one of them can mention that, but I'm pretty sure I got all vegans here. So what we're going to do is we'll go one at a time. Each of you will give about 1 to 2 minutes of just a quick idea of how you view animal welfare and why you're for or against it. And then after everybody gives their 1 to 2 minutes, we'll just have an open conversation. If anybody caught something another person said, wants to challenge an idea, express their idea of like definitions and why they think there's misunderstandings, they can do that. So let's start off with
Carson. Before we begin this portion of this, can I actually just put forward some thoughts that had nothing related to the exact topic, but more about the process here?
It sounds perfectly fine. Lewis, go ahead and start it off.
Okay, so I know this is very informal, but I think that we should still have kind of some basic ground rules. And I came up with, 5 ground rules that we should try to follow as best as we can. So the first one is allow others to finish their thoughts. Try not to interrupt if you can. Second one is try to be fair and charitable in your interpretation to others' positions. Third is be willing to accept that others may hold a very different idea of some key terms that are brought up in this discussion. The fourth is, and I know Carson will love this one, the more divorced from reality a hypothetical is, the less fruitful and meaningful it likely is. And maybe the most important sort of ground rule is please be open-minded and willing to change your mind if you're presented with compelling counter-arguments to your position. So that's it.
Awesome. Okay, I like that. Obviously, except for number 4, if anybody wants to divorce their hypotheticals from reality, they get bonus points from me. But it will affect how Lewis will challenge that. So keep that in mind. Okay. So let's go ahead and start with Pablo. Go ahead and do a minute or two on your thoughts on the topic.
Right. Yeah, I think there is plenty of arguments to support the idea that farm animals live in very bad conditions. They also contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. They also present a risk of increasing the probability of a pandemic and antimicrobial resistance. Now that I guess we agree on that. Ideally, we would quickly move towards a world where we just realize globally that this is an issue at so many levels, also in terms of global health, and we would all just move away from just farming animals. But the reality is that that seems quite an unlikely scenario, and in the coming decades, unfortunately, we're going to still have factory farms all over the place, growing in many different countries where we didn't have factory farms before. So it makes sense that under these conditions, given this sad reality, we should try to make the lives of those animals as good as possible. And I think if we, I think this debate is probably going to be great, and I'm probably going to see other perspectives that I didn't see before. But I think at the end of the day, we have to consider what would the victims think? Like if we could ask animals, and if they knew that they're going to actually be put in these factory farms in the coming years, would they prefer to have slightly better conditions? And if the answer is yes, then I guess promoting animal welfare and having better regulations on farming is probably the right way to go. I can leave it there for now.
All right. Lewis, go ahead. 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I didn't prepare any statements, and I don't even necessarily see this as a 2v2 debate because I don't necessarily disagree that that some welfare, legislation, um, like I don't necessarily disagree with any and all welfare legislation. For me, it would be about the framing of the legislation or the framing of the campaign. What is entailed in the framing or how it's presented. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I'm going to. I don't know any of the other participants here. I don't know your positions on this. I mean, I did hear Pablo's, so now I know Pablo's position, but I may disagree to some extent with all the other participants. I'm not sure because I'm not like fully against or pro.
Lewis, there's a weird sound coming from you, I think.
Hmm.
Sounds like a strange vacuum or a helicopter.
Okay, hold on a sec.
They're coming for you. They didn't like your.
Let me see here if I can see anything that.
I think it's gone.
It's
I think
It's gone
It
now.
sounds
now.
fine now. It sounds like it's gone.
Okay, okay. So yeah, so I'm not entirely sure I will agree or disagree with anybody here because my position is more nuanced. There could be campaigns, welfare campaigns, or legislation that I might not completely disagree with. Generally, though, I could say that I am aligned with abolition values, though. So there, I'll say that as a general rule, but but it really depends on the context and the framing of the legislation or the campaign as to whether or not I could be supportive of it or not. And that's it.
All right. Brandon, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so I decided to do this debate because I've been seeing a lot of infighting amongst vegans, and by vegans, I'm just to get some semantics out of the way, I mean people who reject animal exploitation and want to see animal liberation, right? So that's what I mean when I say vegan. And I think another key thing to differentiate is I am anti-welfareism, right? So I'm not a welfarist. I'm anti-welfarism as like a concept, of saying that it's okay to exploit or to enslave or to kill other sentient beings so long as we treat them this way, right? So I'm against that, but I'm not anti-animal welfare. And I think that vegans who are all fighting for the same goal, which is to see animals liberated, to see the end of animal exploitation, but some vegans think it's a good strategy to take the wins that we can take, whether it's better conditions for animals, whether it's different laws being passed, even if it's not the end goal. I don't see that as harmful or a bad thing for veganism, for animals in any way. So that's kind of what I'm here to defend is all of the vegans who do support laws being passed that aren't the goal of veganism, but still take steps towards that goal, kind of all the hate or all the criticism they get, I don't see that as warranted. So that's kind of what I'm here to defend.
All right. And then really quick before Eric goes, Lewis, I just wanted to let you know there's a few sounds still coming from you. It's not really bad, but I muted you while Brandon was talking. But if you could mute yourself, that way I don't mute you and have it where you think you're talking and you're not. Whenever you're not talking, that'd be good. And same for anybody else. If strange sound starts happening, if not at all times, but if there's like an ambulance outside or anything weird, go ahead and mute yourself when you're not talking. And yeah, okay, go ahead, Eric.
All right. Well, I think I'm very excited to be part of this conversation this morning because I feel like veganism itself is something that is transforming as we watch the industries transform over time. So I think it's a very, very important that we have these kind of difficult discussions to expand what we're doing and reunify. Because in my estimation, animal welfare, to me, this is conversations about animal welfare. It's about animal rights. And although they are very different, for example, a conservationist is an animal welfare person, because a conservationist would say that resources are here for human use, whereas an environmentalist would say the environment is here for its own particular use. Now, as vegans, we have a variety of views on that, but I see the pro animal welfare argumentation as a short term solution to the problems animals are facing right now. And we have to be real about the fact that they do face these environments and these terrible situations, not just in factory farms, but outside in zoos, captivity industries, logging industries, exploitation, labor industries worldwide. So to me, animal rights is the retooling of our belief system to give the proper respect to all sentient beings. And I think as vegans, we all share that, because all I hear from everybody right now is we all want kindness. So to me, animal rights is the long-term solution, and animal welfare is a short-term approach to try to minimize the suffering of the animals are there. But so in my side, again, I would say that I'm more pro animal rights, because I'd like for us to think to that next marker past the animal welfare issue. But I think what Pablo and what Brandon said were spot on, as well as what Lewis said. So I'm really excited to hear more from everybody.
Okay, and then I have a quick question for each of you to test something real quick, and then we'll just get into open conversation, because there does seem to be some kind of, I think a lot of us have different definitions on how this stuff works and how against something we are or not. So let's take something as simple as farms being allowed to have chickens in cages that are closed, that are 1 square foot, and then a law being passed saying that from now on they have to be at least 2 square feet. Anyways, you can view that however you want, but I want each of you to say, would you spend the time to vote for it yourself to make that law go into place? And then would you spend any amount of time, and maybe what that would be, trying to convince others to vote for that? Okay? So, and then after that, we'll just get into full-on open conversation and debate. Eric, go ahead.
It's funny, we actually had a law like that in California several years back to try to enlarge what would be considered more kind or a cage-free type of, I think it was a redefinition of the amount of space for battery hens in California. Mm-hmm. And I did vote for it because it is a vote for kindness in a way, but regardless of how much space they have, the terror of the slaughter is something that I believe is where we need to be focused to really stop what's happening.
Okay, so that would be, you voted for it because that's simple, but you'd rather spend your time talking to others on the street about abolition and veganism and not spend much time. And if that made it fail, then that's fine. Okay. And then I wanted to add one caveat onto it for this hypothetical and answering this question. Let's just say hypothetically, with very good reason, we would assume that that passing this wouldn't be a detriment to animals. I know that can be part of the problem, is that some welfare laws can seem good, but then there can be a detriment to animals. So it's just simply like knowing that this would be what it's claiming without being a detriment to animals. Okay, Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, so as a vegan and as a vegan activist, regardless of what laws get passed, my message is going to be the same, right? So I'm going to advocate for animal liberation, for the end of animal exploitation. We're going to try and get people to see the flaws in their reasoning. I'm going to try and get people to think about other sentient beings. That's what I'm going to do regardless, right? So whether chickens have 1 feet to walk around in or chickens have 10 square feet to walk around in the meantime, I'm still going to be advocating for the same end goal. So for me, any step in a direction where animals can suffer less while they're being exploited by the billions, I view as a no-brainer to pass, right? The only exception being if somehow, like maybe because you said there's no detriment to animals, so somehow the industries that are passing these laws are making more money off of the laws being passed, or some kind of like underlying issue where it actually supports longer term exploitation or something like that. But if we're talking about there's no huge benefit to the industry. The biggest thing is the animals are just getting more space to walk around in. I don't see that as taking away from my goal, right? Because regardless, I'm going to advocate for the same thing. So,
Okay. And Brandon, just real quick, let's say that you were going to spend 3 days a week outside doing an hour-long or 2-hour-long talking to strangers on the street. Would you spend any of that time trying to convince them to vote for this law, or is your time on the street for veganism?
Well, so my time on the street's always for veganism and getting people to think. But if there was because usually laws are you have a certain time period to vote for. So during that time period, I would probably mention it if it's relevant. I'd say, hey, there's a law being passed. You can increase welfare. Because the fact that these laws are being proposed usually means that people are thinking about these sentient individuals, right? Even if they're not thinking about them enough or thinking about them to the degree that we would like them to be thought of, they are still thinking about them and they're considering their moral value. So any step in that direction, that's what I would want to vote for. I'm in support of.
Awesome. Okay. So, Lewis, same to you. It's chickens going from being allowed to be in 1-foot cages to now not being allowed to. It would be 2-foot is the smallest. And we know that the outcome is not going to be a detriment to animals. I brought that up because the California thing, and I'm sure we can get into that later. But Lewis, would you vote for it yourself? And would you spend any time on the street trying to convince other people to vote for it?
So I need clarification. By the way, how's my audio? Is a lot of
You're fine right now. Yeah.
okay. So I need clarification. Are you talking when you're saying that it's no detriment to animals? Are you talking about the animals currently alive in that system?
Yeah, so with the California thing that Eric brought up, I happened to look into it thoroughly because I was debating it with a friend, and it turns out that some people argue that getting the law passed led to more chickens dying because of the way the caging was. They crowded on each other and all this stuff, and so there can be outcomes that could lead us to change our mind on things. But that's why I wanted to just throw out the idea that if whatever was happening, and in this case I'm just talking about these cages, that the cage change itself wouldn't be a detriment to animals.
Yeah, but my question is more specifically are you talking about the animals that are living in those facilities, or are you talking about future generations?
Oh, I see. Yes, the cages would not be a detriment to any animals, present or future. I'm not predicting how other animals outside of these cages will be affected.
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, going on that hypothetical, which, by the way, I think is unrealistic, and that is the whole debate between, I think that is actually hinges on the debate between the abolition approach versus the welfare approach, is the fact that future generations will suffer or will likely suffer due to most welfare legislation. But going on this hypothetical where you're saying that we would know for a fact under this strange hypothetical that no future generations of animals it will be no detriment to them.
No, just no detriment because of the cages. All I'm saying is the cages aren't secretly made of lava. I'm just saying that we're just talking about no outside circumstances. Just would somebody vote to make it where instead of the minimum size being 1 square foot, now in that state or country, the minimum size would be 2 square feet. So then the question just becomes, is that a good thing to vote for outside of possible problems with the cages?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm understanding the contingency of what you added, where you said it's no detriment to animals. I'm not
Just the
understanding
Can
that
I
part.
cages.
can I clarify? Can I try and clarify?
Yep.
So, Lewis, what I think he means is there's no like catch, right? There's no additional detriment. There's no catch to increasing the space. Obviously, the detriment, the original detriment of animals being exploited, murdered, enslaved, all that is still there as normal. He's just saying there's no like catch to the space increase. Right? So it's not going to lead to more animals dying. It's not going to lead to more animal suffering or any. There's no catch to the reform. He's just saying it's
Correct,
just
yeah.
increasing the space. All else being equal, they just have more space to walk around it. That's it.
Is that what you're arguing,
Yes,
Carson?
that's what I'm arguing badly, and Brandon is way better than I am, and yes, that's right.
All right. Under the contingency that this doesn't send a message to the public that the problem is that the chickens don't have 2 feet enough space, and therefore the resolving of this problem is to add 2 feet of to their cages, whatever. If under this contingency the public isn't going to get the impression that it's now okay to eat chickens because of this, then I I probably would support such legislation, but I just don't. I just
But
don't.
there
see
would be no contingency, so the public can easily think that that's fine, and therefore I think you're on the other side of that. You would not, right?
if this hypothetical doesn't rely on a contingency that the public won't. There's no possibility that the public will feel comfortable eating chickens
so,
now
no,
that this.
Yeah, so there's nothing to do with that. So the public might think that, and they might not.
Okay, then I'm definitely not for it.
Okay, yes. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. That's the anti-animal welfare side. That's what
unless
you're on.
unless I can be shown specific language in the particular legislation that addresses more than just the 2 feet of space.
Yeah, and you guys can go over that. I just wanted to get just off the cage thing, and then because your stance might be that the reason it's a flaw is because of how the public will perceive it, and that
100%.
and that can be why you're on your side. Yep. Okay,
Yes.
Pablo, real quick, would you vote for it? And when you do your street time, let's say you're out for 3 days, 3 hours at a time, during that thing being voted on by the public, would you spend much of your time focusing on that or not?
Right. On the first point, I remember there was a study by the Welfare Footprint Project where they were studying how many hours chickens spend on under different levels of pain, and they had 4 categories like annoying pain, hurtful pain, disabling pain, and excruciating pain. And then they have estimates to see like under different caging systems how many hours they spend on each of these levels of pain. So they have in the end like a pain track, and that way they can compare how much better it is for a chicken to be in a slightly bigger cage with respect to a smaller cage. And it turns out that bigger cages do make a difference. Maybe depending on the exact conditions, maybe it makes a bigger or smaller difference because there are different kinds of cages and so on. But overall, it would certainly make a difference. And usually, like when these laws are passed in countries, then that means millions of animals are going to have slightly better lives or significantly better lives. So given all these, it makes sense to me to vote yes. Like I don't see any all things equal. Yeah, there are some small letters that we would need to check if maybe there are unexpected consequences. But in principle, all things equal, it makes sense to vote yes for such a improvement. And whether I would talk about it with other people, given what I just said, I think it would make sense to mention it because we are actually making things better for animals. I guess I would also mention all the other issues that are still there, even when these laws have passed. So one thing doesn't take away the other. Like I would probably mention that it's still not great. It's still pretty much as bad, just a little bit less bad. So yeah, I think that's what I would do.
Okay. And yeah, I wanted to start off with that kind of what I would view as small welfare, just to see where everybody's at, because it seemed like there was a good bit of like middle ground. And so, anyways, go ahead, and whoever wants to start can pick somebody to ask a question to and debate it on.
I'm sorry. I would love to really jump in here, guys, if you don't mind. I have a question for everybody, and this goes along with it. And Carson, I think eggs is a wonderful place to begin because as vegans, we know that a lot of vegetarians, the hard part's getting them past eggs and milk, right? Like this is dairy, it's almost more challenging sometimes to prove to people that they're suffering in dairy versus meat industry. So I'm glad we're using this example. My question to everybody is this. When you go to like let's leave this hypothetical conversation we're having right now. If you are in the grocery store, you look at cheap eggs that are 50 cents for the dozen, you look at cage-free eggs, you look at free cage, you look at whatever Joe Farm, farm pasture raised. Do you look at it and say, great, these guys are doing a good thing? Or do you look at all the eggs with the same, like, that's BS, and it doesn't matter what they say, the eggs are this is still a problem? I'm just curious how you guys find these distinguishments in the grocery store itself.
Yeah, I mean, again, as a vegan, I'm against all animal slavery and exploitation. So yeah, no matter what the label is on the egg, I view them the same. Now, just to clarify a little bit, I think there's a big difference between public perception, right? So like the average person and how they feel or what they think versus legal legislation, right? Or legal or like laws. Because the public is going to think like to what Lewis said earlier, how, the concern about people misinterpreting things, that's our job, right? So as vegans, as vegan activists, our job is to try and get people to think and try and prevent misinterpretation or try and, kind of persuade people to view things a certain way, to think things a certain way. But the actual laws that are being passed, that's kind of a whole nother ballgame in my book, right? So animal rights, that's going to be, it's just a little different. Like obviously somebody could vote for a law perceived, from one perspective, and another person could vote for that same law from a different perspective, right? So, but yeah, to answer your question, I view the eggs as to say.
All right, Pablo, what do you
To
think
me,
of
that
Eric's
was-
question?
sorry, yeah.
Oh, I was just curious about what Pablo was going to say. Like when you see the eggs, what do you think when you see all these varieties? You got pasture raised, you got free range. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that there is variety and people can choose a little bit better or a little bit worse options in terms of animal welfare. But I'm also aware that those pictures that they put on the boxes are not really representing very often of what they actually, of the conditions in which the animals live. They also don't put images of the whole process, just a little bit of it. Maybe some animals have some time outside and they take this beautiful picture and then people think that it's perfectly fine. They also, even when we are talking about free range eggs, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be chick culling involved. Like the process of killing the male chicks, it's still probably going to happen anyway. And that's just not mentioned on any of the labels. So given all these caveats, I don't feel like it's great to have the better options there, because the better options are not that much better. Still, again, overall, I think it's a good thing that there is the options, but none of them are actually great options.
So, it's an interesting question, Eric. I think that the way that a vegan like myself and probably the rest of the people in this panel view that is going to be different from the general public, right? Because people like us have looked into these issues. I remember maybe about 25 years ago or something when I did a presentation in a food co-op regarding, animal welfare, versus abolition. I had researched at that time a number of these, free range farms. I don't remember. I think they were all in the United States. I don't remember if I researched just on the East Coast, but there were various, like free range or, they marketed themselves as, free range and local. And anyway, what I discovered by doing some research is that many of them were headed by people who came from, CAFO, the larger industry. And so to me, it seemed clear that these free range farms, or at least quite a number of them, this was more like a marketing scheme than it was a change in the perception of the people who ran it. And so that's why when I see labels like, free range or whatever, I look at it more as a marketing gimmick than anything else. And also, I know, of course, that there is all sorts of atrocities going on, even if the conditions are better, right? Even if they're abiding to welfare legislation, the conditions are still horrible. They're still being exploited in many horrible ways. So the public, I think, doesn't realize most of this, right? I actually had to do the research. I was committed to do the research on this. And so I know things that the public is just not going to be interested in knowing. They're just going to see some label of a happy chicken or whatever it is, and they're going to think, oh, now it's okay to, eat eggs again because, look, these are happy chickens and stuff like that. So the public perception, of course, is going to be very different in most cases than the perception of somebody like me.
Sorry, Pablo, please.
Oh yeah, I just want to. I think Luis had a good point. Like I think what he's saying is that possibly it could increase the for someone in the public. That would mean that they are more likely now to buy those eggs because they see the picture and they don't know all the things that go behind it, and then maybe they are more likely to buy those eggs than they would otherwise without that label, even if the price is a bit higher. And yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm not sure. We would need to see the numbers because if you increase the price, I think that's usually the most important factor in whether a person is going to buy a product or not. But what you said, I think it would also play a role. So we would need to, just do the market analysis and see if it actually is increasing the sales by having these labels and pictures.
It'd be really interesting to see, the public perception. Especially now with all of our vegan activism, it must be different than previously.
The thing for me is, obviously we could speculate a lot of things, right? So, like for me, I would speculate that if all of the humane, options went away, or the pasture raised, the free range, whatever, if all those options went away, everyone who purchases those options over the factory farm options, those people aren't going vegan, right? Those people aren't vegan, right? They don't view animals as deserving of enough moral value to not exploit them. They don't view them as, as just another species of animal. They still view them as products, right? So all they're doing is they're spending more money on a slightly less cruel or slightly better option, I guess. But if those options went away, they would just buy the cheap stuff, right? They just buy the factory farm stuff. That's my speculation. Again, I haven't seen data on it, but every time I talk to somebody who talks about how they purchase free-range meat or pasture-raised eggs or backyard eggs, they don't talk like a vegan. They don't talk like somebody who cares about animal rights. They talk about someone who just wants to purchase a product. So the argument of, these products existing actually make people feel better about their choices and actually continue or increase the production or increase the sale of these items, I don't see much weight in that just because, right? If there were people who, if there was a poll maybe or some kind of study where people said, if these products didn't exist, I would be vegan, then maybe I would sign off on that or I'd be more on board. But as of now, again, everyone I've talked to who's ever said that those are the products they purchase, they either are lying in the sense that they almost always still purchase factory farmed products, or again, they're just viewing animals as products still. They don't respect them anymore or anything. So, I think the only difference between having these products and not is the experience of the individual animal, right? Because while billions and billions of animals are going to continue being exploited every year, if those conditions can get better, if they can suffer less while that's happening, I don't see that as a negative at all. In fact, I see that as a positive, at least for the experience of the animal, even if that's not my goal, right? Even if I'm not going to stop advocating for them until they're no longer being exploited.
So, Brandon, I loved what you just said about animals as products. Because I was kind of curious if we took the hypothetical to slightly two different versions. We worked with a lot of different sentient beings, and one of them is gorillas. And one thing that we have been advocating for is, for example, in zoos, they breed the animals, and this is the same as in chickens and all the other things. But if we get away from factory farm for a second, I'm curious because, for example, in a zoo, either it's okay that they're there or they need to get out. And the vegans, of course, we fall on the side of we must get it out. And, elephants have been removed from zoos recently being proven sentient. And I think that is a really great case for all of us to look at and say, you know what, we can actually remove these situations from where we have to make this horrible choice of animal welfare versus animal rights. But I think it's one of those situations where people look at animal rights and say, okay, this speciesism is a problem. We need to retool our entire thought process. And so I think in parts, like I said, I feel like we're on both sides of the same coin, short-term and long-term solutions. But my question is sort of like, for example, let's take another one of a mink farm or a fur farm, any fur farm. If the animals are to get one extra meal a day, would vegans be okay with the fur farm continuing? Is our language that the chicken farmer is okay, that the mink farmer is okay, that the zoo is okay because they're treating the animals a little better? Or are we, so, to me, it's an animal rights issue because we have to say, we need them all out. We need to just shut this thing down right now. Let's storm in there and do this. And I'm a little bit more on that extreme side. And I feel that animal welfare is a bit more of trying to work within the system. So in a sense, too, it's a two-pronged approach where maybe we're not working at odds, but working with each other. But I'm curious what you guys feel about in the animal welfare sense if we remove the food animals and we go to things like, say, a fur farm.
Can I respond? So to your point, I would love to, band together and just, take all these industries down like manually, with our bare hands. But for practical reasons and legal reasons, obviously, we can't always do that. But to the fur farm, so like I said at the beginning, I am not a welfarist, right? I do not think that welfare is enough. I don't think that welfare means really anything morally, right, beyond just the experience of the individual. So for me, the message is always stop buying fur, stop exploiting animals for fur, stop this practice or view animals as individuals or, trying to get people to think about their relationship to other sentient beings. That's always my goal. But if there is a law being passed that, okay, instead of fur animals being starved before they get skinned, they actually are well fed, or hey, instead of fur animals being skinned alive, they're being stunned or they're being euthanized before being skinned alive, I would absolutely vote for that law to be passed. Because again, we're 1% of the 1% of the population thinks that animals are sentient beings who are deserving of moral consideration to where they're not exploited, they're not murdered, they're not abused, etc. So 99% of people are either vegetarian, full-on meat eaters, animal exploiters, going to zoos, paying for fur, all these things. So there is no reasonable expectation that any time in the near future, unless something dramatic happens, like some kind of dramatic technology or something, that the world's going vegan or the world's going to start viewing animals as individuals like they should. So with that expectation in mind, the only thing I'm doing by not voting for that is allowing more suffering or allowing a worse experience for those individuals in the meantime. And I don't want to do that. Unless somebody has enough evidence or can show that by increasing their well-being in the meantime, it's actually causing more of a detriment or it's actually going against our goal, then maybe I'd be open to changing that position. But for now, that's kind of where I stand on that.
So I'd like to address what Brandon has said here, but also I think in general, what seems to be missing from the dialogue is how the public perceives these types of campaigns or the messaging. And so I'm pretty sure there's a term. I don't know in psychology what the term would be, but it would describe how people are looking for an easy out to continue to do something. And if they're given this, idea that now, we have these farms that are humane, and even animal advocates are promoting and pushing this legislation that provides 2 feet bigger or 2 inches bigger of a cage for hens, as an example, then it seems most reasonable to believe that the public is going to feel comfortable in eating eggs. And since the public, they want to have the easiest outs, for a short period of time, they may buy eggs from these facilities, where this legislation has passed, but then they're probably not going to continue to do that. It's probably going to slip into their mind that, hey, look, I'm eating eggs anyway. I can just get it cheaper over here. Let me just go over there. So I don't think that the public, by giving them this impression that the eating eggs from these facilities is good, I think that will be detrimental to future generations of animals, because the public is going to have this perception to a large degree that now it's okay to eat eggs. And there was actually maybe about 20 years ago or so, legislation in California, Prop 2, I forget the exact prop. I think it may have been Prop 2 or something. Anyway, it was exactly on this issue. It was promoted by a number of national animal welfare organizations as a great thing that all people should get behind. This was providing some little bit bigger space for battery hens. And so I remember after the proposition had passed, because it was lots and lots of money spent, I don't know, probably millions of dollars by animal welfare organizations or animal advocacy organizations. And there was a leading women's magazine that had polled their readers. And this was, I don't remember if it was Ms. or it was one of the big prominent women's magazines. And they asked them, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact wording, but they basically asked them that now that this proposition is passed, what do you feel about eating eggs? And I guess was, maybe 2 issues later, I guess after they'd received a bunch of responses, a lot of the responses, I think it was the majority from what I recall reading, is that the readers had now felt comfortable eating eggs, and some of them expressed that they were going back to eating eggs again because now they felt that the chickens were in a good place. And so, to me, while this is not in this wasn't a study of let's say millions and millions of people. Certainly that publication had a very large readership, and I think that we can glean something important from these responses, which is about human psychology and how people in general, not vegans, but how people in general may look at these types of campaigns and this legislation as a green light to either continuing to eat animal products or going back to eating animal products, which some of these responders, these readers responded with. Some of them responded they actually went back to eating eggs because they felt now that it was okay to eat eggs. So my contention with the with these types of welfare legislations is that the framing and how these legislations, how they're put forward, is going to lead to increased consumption of animal products, because people are going to feel assuaged about their guilt or possible guilt about eating these animal products. I mean, yes, vegans are whatever it is, 1% of the population, but still, if we're going to spend enormous amounts of time and resources on money on pushing certain campaigns, then it seems counterproductive to the animals, certainly to the future generations of animals, that we push welfare legislation that will likely end up doing more harm than any good.
Can I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a few things about that. That's an interesting study that you mentioned. I think people usually just don't care. Like they're just gonna do what they have always done, and they're not gonna look into the detail of whether that particular animal product they're buying was coming from better or worse conditions. Maybe when you point that out and you say, "Oh, actually, these come from very good whatever conditions," they'll be like, "Oh, great!" But I would have bought it anyway. That's my intuition. But again, we would need to back that up with data. I think animal advocates usually fight for what they believe is realistic. Like there are many animal charities that, of course, they would want to have no animal exploitation at all and no factory farms, etc. But they know that if they're talking to a big meat company, for example, it's pretty much impossible that they're gonna be able to reach an agreement when they propose something like that. So they always need to go on very incremental changes. So that's why usually we have like these very small steps towards better conditions for animals, rather than having like, you're a meat company, but what about just not buying any meat anymore? What about just not producing any more meat? That's just never gonna happen, at least not straight away. And I think that your concern about the future, the possible implications of these incremental changes, is maybe not well justified, because when you look at the consequences of these incremental benefits in animal welfare, they usually come with some cost. Like, for example, if you have a bigger area for animals, that means that you can raise fewer animals in the same space. So usually that implies that the farmers will not be able to raise more animals. Without those regulations, maybe they would be able to have more animals, therefore they are going to make a smaller profit. Maybe that implies that the prices are going to go up at some point, and that means that people will buy fewer of those products. That also means that alternative protein products will have a better conditions for market competition, and therefore more people will start buying those products, and therefore in the long term, those incremental actions are not necessarily bad. They can actually be good. And if you disagree with that, then what I would like to know is what would be the alternative if we don't have these small steps what would be the thing that would lead to ending animal exploitation, in your view?
So, hey, Pablo. So, those are interesting points. First of all, the I think the thing that you might be overlooking with the costs, the increased costs to some of the producers, is that these producers have lobbyists that go to Congress, and what they do is they take these externalities, these costs, and they get their the special interests get their Congress people to vote on these massive subsidies. So a lot of times these costs are not passed on down to directly to the consumer. So while it may be true in some cases or many cases, I don't know, I haven't looked into detail in this, that the cost may increase significantly for some of these products. My gut feeling tells me that it's probably going to be a minimal increase or maybe no increase, depending on what these special interests can get Congress to, dole out billions and billions of dollars to these industries to defray those costs. Now, in terms of what do we do if we don't press for 2 inches bigger in cages or whatever, whatever the welfare campaigns may be. I think we just press forward with sending a unified message that animal exploitation is not morally responsible, and so all of us, I'm assuming, were at one time non-vegans, right? But I'm assuming most of us are vegans now, or at least in this community we're probably mostly vegan, and so we have to understand that there is going to be people are not all people are just completely closed-minded and never going to change, right? We have to understand that depending on our message, people may actually change. And in fact, that's the reason why I continue to do animal activism in the way I do, is because I'm convinced that most people can eventually change with enough education and this type of thing. So the point being is that hold on a second. I'll give you a chance to talk, Brandon. Just give me 1 second. The point being is that I think that some folks may think that the public, is just, we're only 1% vegans and the public will never change. But the problem with that is that if we continue to present the message that it's okay to exploit animals and harm animals just so long as we do it with 2 bigger inches of cages, whatever, then we're never, I don't see a path ever getting to anything that resembles an abolition type of a future, so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a couple things, and I don't think you meant to do this, but I just want to clarify the position again. So we are, again, I'm based on what I heard from Pablo, I assume the same thing, but I'll speak for myself, I guess. I in no way am advocating that animal exploitation is okay so long as we get a certain level of treatment, right? So the message is always one of abolition. The message is always one of ending all animal exploitation, right? So that's very important with the context, because if that isn't the message, then I'm against. Like that's being a welfarist, right? So we're in agreement, Lewis, that being a welfarist or saying that this is okay so long as we get a certain level of treatment, yeah, I'm against that. I disagree with that, right? So the only difference sounds like between me and Pablo and you and Eric, or maybe I'll speak for just Lewis because Eric can maybe he differentiates a little bit, but the only difference sounds like is we expect the shift to a vegan world to happen with many, many incremental changes, many kind of law after law after law, reform after reform after reform, and people kind of changing their perception over time. And we see that and the reason why I expect that is because we see that with every single social justice movement in the history of anything. If you look at civil rights, if you look at women's rights, if you look at gay rights, if you look at any kind of social justice movement, it always happened with incremental changes and the law changing people's perception. Not actually, well, obviously the law changes because education, because awareness, because investigations, all these things. But you have no idea how many times I talk to somebody and they say, well, it's legal, isn't it? Right? Well, it's legal, so I'm not doing anything wrong. Right? I think people really underestimate how much social norms and the law actually forms people's values. Right? People think that just because something's legal, therefore, I'm not doing anything wrong, right? So people have this barrier of, well, something is legal, therefore it's normal. And Louis, you mentioned the fear or the concern of giving people the wrong idea or like normalizing animal exploitation. Animal exploitation is already normalized. Right? We need to look at where we're starting from. We're starting from people thinking animals are essentially animatrons, just with the perception of vegetables. Right? So people think that animals literally, they either think that they don't feel anything or they have so much cognitive dissonance that they'll love some animals and hate others. Right? So we are starting from nothing. Right, we're starting that. That's like the equivalent of, like if we look at a human slavery, right? And there were abolitionists who were saying, hey, there's a law that could be passed where instead of slaves being beaten and assaulted daily, that stops, right? So we stopped doing that, and now slavery's still legal, but they're going to stop being beaten, stop being assaulted, and if you're caught doing that, you get fined or you get jail time or whatever it is, right? That, from my speculation, is not going to normalize slavery any more than it already was normalized, right? Because it's a practice happening, right? That's the norm. The norm has always been animal exploitation, animal abuse, animal murder. So I don't think that these laws being passed to increase animal welfare, or because we're talking about small stuff like 2-inch cages, but then we could talk about bigger welfare, right? What if there was a law being passed that would end animal slaughter and just had just allowed animals to be slaves for eggs and dairy and zoos, right? What if there were law changes that really improved the lives or improved the outcomes of animals long term? So small welfare laws, yeah, I mean, we could take them or leave them essentially, right? But bigger stuff, that's kind of, something that's also important to talk about, because I want to be on the side of voting and supporting the incremental changes that lead to the ultimate perception change in the end of animal exploitation. And Louis dropped out, but okay.
Okay, so it looked like Louis dropped out, and then I had Eric muted. Oh, Eric dropped out. Eric's all
right, so we win.
Yeah. Eric's laptop died. He sent me a private message, and then he switched over to his phone, but I muted him because the phone was loud. So I was going to have Eric respond to that. Okay, here he is. Okay. Eric, welcome back.
Sorry, guys, I'm out in the field today, so it's a little challenging on my signal.
No, you're fine. Did you want to respond to Brandon until Louis gets back?
Yeah, actually, I really like a lot of the points that you make, Brandon, and I do believe that you're right on with so much of it. We really, it is a slow change. It is an idea that you take one pebble and you move it to the other side of the scale of justice, and even though nothing moves, once you get a million there, then it'll change. And I do think that we have to remember that we have a long journey ahead. But I would like to say that I do think when it comes to animal welfare versus animal rights, it's a challenging concept because neither are against the other, right? Like the animal welfare, like where you guys are you, I know you're not a welfarist, but you are defending a law for animal welfare, a law that ultimately allows the farms to stay open. And not that that's what you want, but you want kindness for the animals. And so I think it's really important that we always remember that that is in support of animal rights, and animal rights themselves is a bigger stroke. You know, it's a redefining of our concepts to animals. So like I was thinking of it, for example, earlier when we were all talking about the cube of truth, or, you know, different types of vegan outreaches that we all like to do or watch out there. And what we try to convince people of is, you know, tap into your inner, you understand this is wrong. So I do think that, you know, although we have a lot of in common here discussing animal welfare versus animal rights as approaches, I do think they're very different. You know, because animal welfare is I'd like to use the example of the turkey. There was a recent book called Consider the Turkey by Peter Singer. About Thanksgiving and about turkey, and he goes through the insemination process down to the killing process, and there's 30 processes that these animals go through that is absolute torture. So even if they were to put a bill out for one of them, although the kindness would be to, obviously I would vote for it because you want to vote for kindness. 1 out of 30 changes isn't making that big of a difference for an animal that is there. And we just, my view is, as vegans, it would be nice to see a more unified approach as well. But I think it's great that we're talking to everybody on their level also. Like if your grandma's going to buy your eggs, you know, like I can't remember who said it, but they're going to do it no matter what. And I think, you know, Pablo mentioned that. I think it was very true. You know, and that we're there to say either buy these eggs or don't buy eggs because, you know, this industry is cruel. So it's a very challenging aspect. But I think that animal rights as vegans is, for me, something that we have to demand a little bit more, because we have to demand these farms are shut down, not modified.
Can I quickly reply to some of the things that have been said in the last 5 minutes or so? First, on Luis, he was saying that if we improve the welfare conditions of animals, that's not necessarily going to be reflected on the price that consumers will see when they go to the supermarket. And that could be true, but that also means that they need to receive more subsidies. You were mentioning that as well. And at some point, like if we're talking about the European Union, they also need to, like, it's money at the end of the day, and they need to decide, should we invest more money on these subsidies on factory farms, or should we actually, given that it's becoming more expensive, maybe we should try these alternative proteins that are growing? And, you know, like at the end of the day, it's money. Like if we are making these processes a little bit more demanding in terms of the conditions required for the production of meat, then eventually, like, the market is gonna listen to it, and it's gonna change, even if it takes longer. But a little bit, it does make a difference, and eventually, it is reflected in the prices that the consumers will see. So that's one thing that I think is good considering, even if it's very slowly happening. Another thing is that messaging, like talking to people and saying, "Hey, look at all these atrocities," and so on. I wish it was more effective, but, you know, we can see the data on polls on how many people have become vegan. There is maybe a slightly increasing population that are vegetarian or reducitarian or flexitarian. Maybe there is a little bit of that. It's not super crystal clear, but certainly the number of vegans is just pretty much the same everywhere, as long as in terms of polls that I have seen. So it feels like it may not be the most effective way. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I think we should still do it, but we should certainly not rely only on that, because it's going to take hundreds of years until we actually convince everybody to become vegan. And last thing on regulations and laws passing and so on. there are some things, positive changes that have happened recently. For example, in Mexico, animals have been, they are going to enter in the constitution. I don't know exactly what consequences this could have, but it certainly feels like a move in the right direction, and that's the result of many animal advocates that have been fighting for this. So it feels like it's probably something we should be celebrating. But I also think I have seen, for example, that in Spain there were some last year or this year, I don't remember, some very strong laws about the treatment of animals, mostly pets. But it came, I think, I mean, I'm on board. I think it was very good, but it also came with a bunch of backlash, right? Like, and we have to be aware of that. Like, if we aim very high, we can also face backlash, and it could actually end up being more detrimental than not. And that's why, again, this favors small changes overall, because in the long term, when you aim too high, you can actually get the opposite result.
If I can just respond to what Eric said a little bit, and then I'll let Lewis chime in or whoever. I was gonna say, well, and again, because you said the welfarism versus animal rights. What's funny is I know a lot of vegans would actually say the term animal rights is kind of not vegan enough, or is like a welfarist thing, right? I know a lot of vegans who purely believe in changing mindsets and that animals don't need legal protection, or that's not even a thing. I disagree. I think that animals do need legal protection, right? Because we're never going to get everyone to not be speciesist, to not be racist, to not be sexist, right? So legal protection is essential and important. And I think that, to Pablo's point, if we look at politics, right? Because when we're talking about the law, we're talking about politics, right? We're talking about working within systems, right? So if a political candidate tries to run for office and they advocate for what they truly want, right, whether they're on the left or the right, they're not going to get voted in, right? Because people do not handle extremes well, they do not handle change well. So even if we wanted, right, I'm sure many people have tried to propose bigger changes, stronger laws, better animal rights, proposals, but they just get shut down, right? Because they don't have the majority, they don't have enough support for those changes. So I agree with you, Eric. I think that 100% we need to advocate and push for even stronger laws or even more protection for animals, and still try and tackle and change people's minds to be vegan, to be against all animal exploitation. And that's what we're trying to do. But in the meantime, right, these little laws are being proposed. So I think a key thing is not to view this as one or the other, right? Do we support these little law changes, or do we go full throttle and try and end all animal exploitation? We can do both, and I think we should do both. I think a key thing that also is being missed in terms of like the public perception is how many times like I'll have a conversation and they'll say, well, I'm against torturing animals, right? I'm against torturing animals, but eating them, wearing their skin, all that's fine. And when you ask them, well, why are you against torturing animals? The reason they usually give is the same reason why they should be against all the other forms of exploitation, right? And what these laws do, from what I've seen, again, I don't have studies, so I'm speculating, but from what I've seen is they get people thinking about why they're being proposed in the first place, right? Because if the baseline is, well, we could do whatever we want to animals. We could breed them, we could abuse them, we could beat them, we could eat them, we can skin them, we could whatever, right? It's all on the table. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, maybe we shouldn't torture them, right? And then people are going, why shouldn't we torture them? What's the reasoning behind not wanting to inflict prolonged suffering to the animal? right? And once you can connect the dots between that reasoning of, well, they're sentient, they can feel pain, they can feel joy, they have a subjective experience, that's going to trickle into other practices or into their mindset towards animals as a whole. From my experience, from what I've seen. So
Yeah. I'm going to hop in here real quick. Eric, I saw you were going to talk, but I just want to make a couple comments on some concepts really quick. So I'm not going to share my opinions on anything, but just something Brandon said made me want to share this to maybe make some of these labels. You just get some ideas out there. So I was talking with some people about this topic last week, and one example I used after it got brought up that I used to describe animal welfare and like an option, like if somebody would spend time advocating for it, involved the idea in New York. There was a law that was being passed about the idea of making it illegal to sell cats, dogs, and rabbits in stores. And I was using that as an example, kind of like we were talking about with the cages, to see if somebody would vote for it. The person that was anti-animal welfare said no, they wouldn't vote for it. And then a good friend of mine pointed out that I was wrong in even using that as an example, which I love when I'm wrong. I love when changing minds is so good. They pointed out that that is an abolition law. So there can be things that don't end all of animal use, but if the law itself is referring to ending animal use, so saying no stores can have cats, dogs, or rabbits at all, then that sounds like it might be an animal welfareist thing, but that's actually that making it abolition for those three animals and stores. And so I think that's something worth thinking about, where a welfareist law might be a circus that uses dogs and cats or something, saying that they have more room, or you can't beat them. If you're caught beating them, then your circus will get closed down. So that's something I think worth thinking about. And then also I want to point out with animal rights, I think something that gets kind of misunderstood. If you ignore the idea of natural rights, so we're just talking about legal rights, you can have animal liberation completely just for all animals, and you can also have animal welfare, making bad processes better. And in both these cases, both of these things are completely animal rights as far as the law goes. You can have like anything you think of that you think somebody should have the right to not have happen, like none of us should be in cages at all, right? But also none of us should be in 10-foot cages. None of us should be in 20-foot cages. Any possible thing involving a harm we don't think we should have is a right. So I think animal rights is an umbrella term that covers all of animal liberation and all of animal welfare. And so I think that's something worth thinking about when we use these terms. Okay, so sorry for cutting you off. Eric, you should say your thoughts, and then I think Lewis was going to respond to Brandon as well after that. Oh, your mute's on. I don't think it's me. Eric, your mute's on. You have to unmute it. Yeah,
Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. Thank you. This is really actually fascinating. I don't know if you all are familiar with the Non-Human Rights Project, which is a company that's not necessarily vegan, but they fight for vegan sort of liberation of all animals. What I was going to say is, okay, I'm 51, so I have been sort of watching. We had to convince a different crowd than the younger generation has to convince. So there's also that semi-discrepancy. I come from a world of people didn't, it's like Old Yeller where they just shoot the dog at the end of the movie and that's the deal. There was not a lot of kindness. There was a lot of I think, therefore I am, Descartes, as opposed to actually understanding animals have souls and sentience. But what we've seen is an amazing change internationally. Now in America, we haven't caught up yet. And I want to bring up the examples of in England, they've passed a law, and I don't know if you guys would consider this welfare or rights, but they've passed a law where tourist agencies can no longer sell tickets or advertise companies that exploit animals. They passed a law that circuses can no longer use live animals. They passed a law removing elephants from all of their zoos and exploitation due to recognizing their sentience. So I think that when we look at where we are right now, um, we have had victories, and we are seeing victories that are liberating animals under the legal systems that we have and enabling them to go have the full lives they're intended to have. Now, once the animal rights part stops, the animal welfare part kicks in, because we have a duty to care and take care of them. We work with a lot of sanctuaries. We just got back actually from rescuing a baby elephant in Thailand from exploitation into sanctuary. And it is a big challenging thing, because sanctuaries have their own set of challenges. But I just want to say that, Brandon, I think, and Pablo and Louis, everybody has been sort of saying in a way the same thing. What we want is to do better for animals and to have a better future. And all of us see these different ways of doing it. And I agree. I don't think they work against each other. I think they work for each other. But I think that we can remember that maybe sometimes in some conversations, they are one in the same, as we all as vegans want to not see no animal exploitation, whether it's labor, food, entertainment, anything like that. So, it's been amazing to have this conversation today, but I wanted to bring up the fact that animal rights as we demand you make a change does work. And animal welfare as we demand that you make a change for these animals does work. But again, I stand with the animal rights. I say, 2 more inches in a mink farm isn't going to help the mink. And let's keep fighting, because we can make a change, and we're seeing it now. And this younger generation, some of you guys are on the call here, are making a huge change that is really saving tons of animals. So we just keep moving in our vegan thoughts, and I know we're all going to find a way to be in unison.
I just want to clarify Carson's clarification earlier, and then I'll stop talking. I think what Carson was trying to say, and Carson, I don't mean to keep doing this, but I just want to clarify a little bit.
No, you're good.
Because animal rights to me is any kind of legal enforcement or legal change that affects animals, right? Or I would assume positively. But so like whether it's welfare reform or actual liberation, if it's legally enforced or legally, changed by the law, that to me is under the umbrella of animal rights, which is kind of, I think, what Carson was saying. Whereas like something like veganism, right, the choice to not participate in things that are legal, that's more of like a philosophy or more of like a concept, right? More of like based on the individual's moral values. Whereas animal rights would be pushing anything that is giving animals more rights legally, right? So whether it is giving animals the right to not be stuffed in a cage, or it's giving animals the right to live their life freely, if it's legally changed or legally enforced, then that's an animal right to me. That's so.
Yep. That is a better version of what I was saying. And then, Louis, did you want to respond to what Brandon said a second ago?
Yeah, so my internet completely cut out. I don't know if it's due to the fact that very recently I got new service and new equipment, new router, new modem, so it may have something to do with that. So I lost a lot of whatever happened when I was trying to get online with my mobile phone, and then I wasn't getting any audio there. Anyway, so I'm going to address a couple of things that I heard just before I lost connection, but I do want to address something that you just mentioned, Carson, which is I think that the person that you were referring to might have been me, because we had a conversation and I was the one who brought up to you. Now, it could have been somebody else as well, but
It was you. I just didn't want to mention that.
yeah. And so I was the one who mentioned that banning the sale of animals in pet supply stores, quote unquote pet supply stores, may be more aligned with an abolition type of legislation. So now going to addressing something that Brandon had said, is that I think that, Brandon, you may be misconstruing my part of my position. So I'm not opposed to incremental change or laws being passed. I'm just opposed to certain types of laws being passed, and then of course that would mean certain types of possible incremental change, where whereas the incremental change for the current chickens, I would be, let's say, opposed to incremental change in the sense that maybe conditions for the current chickens are improved, but if that means that there's going to be more animals that are going to be killed in the future, uh, because of the reinforcement of these notions that animals are here for us, then I would be opposed to that type of incremental change. So it really is dependent on the context
Can I
of
ask a
what is
clarifying
meant
question?
by incremental change, or the passing of laws. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the passing of laws, or not necessarily opposed to incremental change.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So for you, essentially, it just depends on what law. So you're not against all welfare reform or all laws supporting, different animal whatever, right? You're not against all of that. For you, it just depends on if there's a reasonable expectation for there to be more exploitation in the future because of that law.
Yeah, basically, I'm looking at this as a consequentialist. Yes.
So my only question would be, then, what is the evidence that that would happen, right? Because you might have some, I don't know. Because for me, like, we can all speculate. It's hard to say, like, if we put it in the human context, right? It's hard to say that by stopping the beating and assaulting of slaves, of human slaves, that's going to lead to more slavery or longer term slavery, right? It's kind of a coin toss, right? Unless there's any kind of like actual statistics or some kind of firmer evidence. I would say that by not supporting the better treatment and not taking into account the individual's experience off of a speculation is kind of tough. I just, for me, I would always err on the side of improving the experience of the victim if I don't have any hard evidence that it's actually going to lead to that undesired outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would say I do have some hard evidence, which is one of the things I presented earlier about the women's magazine, which was I don't know if at the time it was the largest women's magazine. It may have been. So there's evidence right there. Now, like I said, one may not consider that significantly robust evidence, but to me, that is clear evidence that the type of welfare legislation that was passed seem to have a marked detrimental impact on the future lives of chickens. But also, we can just look at human psychology, right? I think human psychology will help to inform us to understand that if people are given this green light to think that now it's okay to eat animals, then what is going to prevent them from thinking that they should ever change that perception, right? If these ideas that it's okay to instrumentally use animals is being reinforced by certain types of welfare legislation or campaigns, then why would we ever expect people to not change? And as a result of that, maybe that is a big part of the reason why there's only 1% of people, let's say in the United States, that are vegan. Maybe because we're sending these mixed messages, right?
Yeah, I mean, because you keep bringing up this concept of like if people are getting the green light, because like I've said from the beginning, regardless of what laws are passed, I'm advocating for the same thing. And I think almost every vegan activist is going to advocate for the same thing, which is ending all exploitation, regardless of what laws are passed, right? So when you say like, oh, they might get the green light, the green light is already there. None of this is illegal. None of this is even frowned upon by the vast majority of people. The green light's already there. So I think as long as the messaging, which I think we agree on, Lewis, as long as the messaging is firm on abolition, as long as we are trying to convince people or trying to tap into people's reasoning and get them to a point where they stop viewing animals as products and view them as individuals, I don't think any of these laws are going to like green light animal exploitation any more than it already is.
Just before I let hold on just one second before I let Eric or Pablo speak, I just want to say that yes, people have this common notion that it's okay to instrumentally use animals, but what we're doing, I would argue, with most or certain welfare campaigns and legislation, we're reinforcing these notions, and that has to be distinguished from these notions that are already held, right? We're reinforcing these notions. And as animal advocates, people who are supposed to be advocating against the instrumental use and exploitation of these animals by us, as animal advocates reinforcing these notions, then I think that is an added problem to the problem that already exists. So go ahead, either Pablo or Eric.
Real quick, I just want to say, it's interesting as we talk about eggs. I was just imagining the carton of eggs and never seeing the vegan symbol of approval on them, no matter how we change it. But what I wanted to kind of mention when it comes to that is I was just thinking about my mom, and Louis, you bring it up an amazing, interesting, unintended consequence I've never even considered, which is because she does believe that there are kind farmers and kind eggs, she continues to buy them, but it gives her a little conscience for her pillow at night to say, okay, I did the right thing. I didn't harm any animals today. I'm going to crash out. And it's an interesting thing because it does, in a way, fertilize and promote the concept of there can be kind slaughter. Which is something that does somewhat conflict with our messaging in a drawing the long bow and thinking about that. So I just wanted to bring up that I've never thought about that unintended consequence, but that is a fascinating aspect of human psychology that maybe we are becoming, we're giving an excuse, and the other thing I wanted to say real quick is interesting. We talked about animal rights. I hadn't thought about animal rights in the sense of laws before. I was thinking more in the terms of animal fundamental rights, I guess. Revisiting them as sentient beings, and again, I do hold that as interesting as all the arguments have been so far, that allowing any exploitation to any degree does contradict our overall purpose and intention as vegan activists.
Gotcha. Really quick, I want to hop in because we've reached the time that we've talked about, but I'm fine with talking further. But I have a follow-up, like a final question for each of you guys that I want to go over before anybody starts dipping out or anything. And this is, I think, the most important question to ask when it comes to any possible thing that can be debated. And that question is, what would make you change your mind? So, Pablo, I'll start with you. I'm just curious, and if anybody has a response to what anybody just said, just try to remember that so this doesn't get in the way of it. But Pablo, what's the simplest thing that could take place? And I say simplest because obviously with anything you could create the most wild thing where this wild thing would make me change my mind. And that might have to be the case. But what's the simplest thing that could exist in this world that you could perceive or read or whatever that would make you all of a sudden say, I'm going to stand on the side of I'm against animal welfare?
Right. Okay. I'll first address a few things that have been said before and then respond to that. So first, I also consider myself a consequentialist, like Luis said. And in fact, I think that we are pretty much all on the same page on pretty much 90% of what we're talking about. So it doesn't feel like a debate, but rather like we all agree pretty much on everything. I think maybe I don't care that much about labels, but I think there is this distinction between welfareism and new welfareism. And I guess we're all probably in agreement of new welfareism in the sense that we agree on the final goal. We may disagree a little bit on the path towards the goal, right? Because I have talked to vegans that were, for example, against using alternative proteins and promoting that. And I think, why would you do that if it's a very good strategy as a consequentialist to reduce the production of meat from animals. Why would you be against that? But some vegans seems to be against that because they prefer the solution of convincing everybody to go vegan, like eating plant-based food. And I just think, in terms of just ask the victims, ask the animals, and what would they prefer? They would clearly prefer that we promote alternative proteins. I also think that we may be putting too much emphasis in people's minds. And again, like, people just don't care that much. Like, people just want to live their lives. And if they find in the supermarket some product, they're going to buy the cheapest one or something that they like because of the taste and so on and so forth. If you have very deep conversations with an individual about the origins of the products and so on, like not just meat, but also like where the clothes come from or whatever other products they buy, they may actually realize, oh, actually, I didn't know about that. Maybe I'm going to stop buying that product. But it's just unfeasible to try to do that with even a sizable fraction of the population. So I think we should do anything as long as it strategically helps reducing animal suffering. So with that in mind, with that out of the table, the question was, what would make me change my mind? And I really like that question. But now I'm not sure about what exactly I would need to change my mind, because it feels like we all.
Yeah, let me
90% agree,
clarify that before you answer it, and it might be better to have Brandon clarify it for me. But no, just kidding. Okay, so here's the thing. I want to point out where I think you guys disagree, because I think you guys agreed, and I could be completely wrong. You guys could let me know. So I think the best way to look at something like this is if we're looking at welfare for animals. So something like making the lives better for animals that are being used. So if they're not being used, like the not being allowed to be in pet stores, we'll call that liberation. Any case where they're going to be used, but there's a law telling you how you can use them, we're going to call that animal welfare. And so the difference between being pro-animal welfare and anti-animal welfare, in my mind, would be spending time to, instead of having a sign saying, why aren't you vegan, or come talk to me about veganism, recognizing that right now there's about to be a vote on this law. And so when you're out where you normally would have a sign saying, why aren't you vegan, come talk to me, you would say, have you heard of this law, come talk to me. And so what I gather is, whenever there's a law not being in place, Pablo's going to be talking on YouTube or on the streets about veganism. When there's a law that could be passed, my guess, from what I'm understanding, is that Pablo would try to get as many people to go for this as possible, because if he's just talking about people about turning vegan and he can get a dozen people a week to go vegan, whereas if he could convince a couple hundred people to vote for this thing and barely get it to pass and become a legal thing, like 51%, like if it wasn't for Pablo getting 100 people there, it might not have passed, that would be his focus. And so the question would be, what would make you decide, I am not going to try to get people to vote for this, to vote for animal welfare? And then I'll also throw in where I think everybody else stands. I think Lewis is on the opposite end, where if it's animal welfare and not like the dog cat one, that for the most part, not only would he not vote for pretty much any of those, he would not spend his time getting others to vote for it because he thinks it's wrong. Now, Brandon and Eric, from what I'm gathering, is there's a good chance that both of you, when you're on the streets, you're mostly going to be talking about liberation and just go vegan. But if vegans and other people are wanting to focus on this law, you're not going to judge them. You're going to think you want the law to go through, but you might not think it's worth spending much time focusing on the law. I think Brandon's a little closer to Pablo than Eric is, but both seem to fit in that camp. So when Pablo answers the question, it's what would make you stop trying to get as many people to vote for this as possible? And then with Brandon, when it gets to you, you can say if you think I'm wrong on my prediction there. But I don't know how you'd answer that. I don't know what the question exactly is for you. But anyways, maybe after Pablo answers, you guys could, because what I want to know, since you guys are so similar, is if you wouldn't spend time trying to get people to vote on a law, when that's an option, if you don't even talk about that law while it's being proposed to be voted on, and you only talk about turning people into vegans, then the question would be, what would make you switch over the other direction? So even though Brandon's not against animal welfare, if he personally wouldn't try to get voters himself, then the question is actually on the opposite side. What would have to exist to make you want to get voters? So anyways, Pablo, go ahead, and then we'll go to somebody else after that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's much more clear now. And I think we may not even need to talk about like the situation of the law, but I can maybe give a simpler example that could also depict the cracks between us, like the difference in opinions in this debate. Like, I don't usually tell people to go vegan. I usually tell people to reduce their meat consumption. And why do I do that? Because I think that strategically it's better for the animals. And would I want them to go vegan? I absolutely would. But I think strategically, and I recently published a video on that, I recommended people to become vegan allies rather than vegans, because I think it's more likely that they would accept that challenge rather than the challenge of going vegan. So it's just a strategic move. And I really wish that I could just tell people, hey, look at this video, go vegan. But I have tried it in the past, and I've realized that my success rate was very low. And I think just asking people to reduce their meat consumption is a better strategy. So I think that answers the question. It's the same for any incremental law that would pass. I would, if I think that strategically that's a better use of my time, I would go for it. To be convinced of the other, of the opposite, of the counterfactual, like what would make me go to ask people again to go vegan 100%, 100% or nothing? I would just need to see data and be demonstrated that it actually works, because so far I think, unfortunately, that works only on a small percentage of the population.
Gotcha. Okay, so Eric, assuming that when you're on the street talking to people that your focus would just be on veganism, even if there is a law being voted on, like say 1 week from that day, if you would not be trying to convince people to vote for that law, what would it take to convince you to start getting people to vote for laws for animal welfare?
It really is a great question, because in my experience, animal welfare always keeps the door open for exploitation. So it's a very tricky, slippery slope to allow farmers to continue in their way. The way that I might see it is knowing that, I work so much in conservation and environmentalism that, a lot of the laws that are coming down the pipes, especially, as a vegan activist. But I'm more of an activist for animals as opposed to a vegan activist in many ways. We work on trying to save endangered species and keystone species through exploitation worldwide. So, that is a lot of what we focus on. So to me, it's nice that this kind of law to me is would be something that is it's trickery, that they're using people's emotional kindness and emotional intelligence against themselves and against the animals to, like I said, create this little pillow for their conscience as they fall asleep at night, thinking they didn't do anything wrong. But what we need to do is shut these farms down. And I think in my camp, in my estimation, knowing that they're using people's emotional intelligence and emotionality and kindness and the genuine, like, I think people are good. I know it's a big debate. I think people at the heart of it are good. And I think we choose what's best always, considering what the options are that we're offered. So to me, you take that kind of an energy and it's wasted in an animal welfare law when it could be going to an animal rights law. And we have had them passed. They can be done. And if we can reach for the moon and the stars, we should, because sometimes we achieve it. So to me,
Okay.
I think we need to know that this is a great opportunity that we see people will support changes for animals and their happiness and their thing. But what are we offering them? Maybe we can kick it up a notch. So that's I don't know if that answered, but
Okay.
that's my
Well,
estimation.
yeah. So essentially, you can't think of anything that could make you change your mind on this.
I mean, it's of course, on a practical level, like you had mentioned before, I would of course vote for anything that could help. I don't want to. There's no benefit for the animal for me to vote no. They're just going to be continually exploited. So I do think we have that. But as Lewis mentioned, there's an unintended consequence that allows the cruelty to be perceived as kindness. And in that trickery, we find the deference of moving to veganism from vegetarianism. Me personally, there's nothing that really could fully convince me that animal welfare is worth the conversation versus approaching the conversation from an animal rights camp.
Okay. Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, so one thing I just wanted to point out from earlier, I don't want to take too much time, but I also think there's a difference between animal welfare reform or animal welfare laws and lying to the public, right? So like when we think of like humane eggs, right? When you go to the grocery store and you see pictures of happy chickens or pictures of chickens being treated nice, that's not included in what I support, right? So I don't support lying or creating a false narrative disguised as welfare. That's not what I support at all. I'm talking about real, actual welfare that's enforced, that's by the law. So there's a big key, because I do think creating a false narrative and the idea that there's a happy farmer or a happy animal who's happy to be milked or happy to have their eggs taken, I do think that is wrong, and I would be 100% against that. So just to be clear, that's not welfare to me. Now, what would take me to change my mind? So when I'm on the street, my number one goal as a activist, as a vegan content creator, whatever you want to call it, is to have good conversations and to get people to change their mind or to think about the animals, right? Change the way they think about the animals. That's always my number one goal. That's really all I care about when it comes to when I'm on the street. What they choose to do in their life, I think, is so up in the air. We really don't have any hard statistics, right? Psychology, yes, human psychology is very interesting, and we know a lot about it. But it's very hard to know the right combination of words or the right approach for each individual person, right? What made me vegan was logic, right? Being shown that I'm contradicting my values by not being vegan. What makes someone else vegan is seeing slaughterhouse footage, knowing that the cute puppies, or sorry, not puppies, the cute cows, the cute pigs, the cute whatever, they're having their throats slit, right? So what's gonna make people vegan is gonna differ from person to person. So psychologically, I can't, it's all speculation. It's hard for me to say. So for me, I'm not really here saying, hey, every activist should try and get people to vote on certain laws. If I'm aware of it and I'm educated on the law, then I might spend some time at the end of the conversation being like, hey, just so you know, whether you go vegan or not, there's this law being passed. If you want to see better treatment for animals, you should support it, whatever, right? But the conversation is always going to be centered on veganism, animal rights, speciesism, etc. Now, what would change my mind? So what I meant to say was the broader concept is when I see other vegans who are involved in organizations who are trying to get these laws passed, right? Or who are trying to advocate for welfare reform, right? And they're vegans, mind you. So it's a vegan organization. They're vegans who are doing this. And they have comment sections filled with vegans who are saying, you're not vegan because you're doing this, or don't waste your time advocating for better conditions for animals. This doesn't do anything, right? I have an issue with people going off speculation and trying to stop progress or trying to stop other vegans from doing approaches that they think is effective with very little to no evidence. That's my issue. So what would change my mind is evidence, right? If somebody, and I know Lewis said he provided some, obviously I'm taking his word for it, but a poll from a women's magazine is not really evidence to me, but I mean, it's something, but it's really not, gonna change my mind. I would need some kind of peer-reviewed study in the sense of hard outcomes, so actual like money, right? What's being sold, what's being bought, actual documented cases, or maybe like animal lives, whatever. And then also polls of large populations of people who are actually not changing their mind or changing slower because of these reforms, right? And again, separate from humane washing. I'm not talking about lying, right? I'm not talking about, but I don't go vegan because the chickens are happy, I saw it on the carton. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people not changing because animals are getting more rights in the, when we're talking about welfare, they're still legal rights. So that would be what changes my mind.
Okay, and then I'm about to ask Lewis the same question, but before, Brandon, I wanted to challenge you on something that you just said. I'm just curious to see how this goes. So going along with what Lewis said about that magazine where women said, I think it was a women's magazine, but they were saying that they stopped eating eggs, but now because of this they feel better and they're going to go back to it. So let's say that there's a law going through that was going to give chickens more room, that law, and then you vote for it, you get other people to vote for it, it goes through. And then you can look at the year before that law went through and see how many eggs were sold. And then you look at the year that takes place after the law goes through, and you see that egg purchases go up like 20%, maybe 40%, because somehow there were so many people that weren't eating eggs because they thought it was immoral, but now they see that because the chickens are treated better, they want to eat eggs. That number goes up, and then people talk about it, and it's going to be an option to vote back to get them into smaller cages. Would that outcome be something like what you're talking about, a significant number of more purchases, therefore more chickens being harmed, that would do it?
Yeah. So just to be clear, I wouldn't go back. So here's the thing. If that was a statistic, yes, then probably going forward, I would change my approach. So instead of actually maybe pushing those laws, I would just focus on the vegan conversation, or just focus on an abolitionist approach and not even mention laws, not even mention welfare, just focus on that. If that were the case, but I would not vote. I would not vote them back into smaller cages. I mean, at that point, the law's already passed. The individual experience is better for those chickens as it is. And then going forward, I would just continue. I would just change my approach. So I would probably advocate for people to, why it's still wrong. I mean, I do that anyway. That's the point. Is my approach doesn't change regardless of the law. But I would just make sure not to. I mean, it depends on the context. I would have to know why egg purchases went up, because there's other confounding factors. But assuming that's all built into the hypothetical, assuming it's clean as day, before the law passed, there were less people buying eggs than after the law passed, even though the law was supposed to increase welfare or increase the lives of chickens. I'd probably change my approach going forward.
Okay, cool. And I don't think that's a realistic thing to happen, but I thought it was a reasonable enough challenge.
Yeah.
Okay, Lewis, what would make you change your mind and start advocating for welfare laws?
So the reason why I would be opposed to approving or advocating for the type of legislation that seems to be proposed here. Now, we didn't go into details of what exactly the wording of this legislation is, but assuming that it is typical welfare legislation, which doesn't provide, in my view, sufficient context as to the fact that the animals, shouldn't be seen as commodities in the first place. So I'm going by the understanding that this welfare legislation is only addressing, let's say a few inches or a couple of feet of bigger space for the animals, and it's being pushed as, this is, a great thing that everybody should get behind. Animal welfare organizations are just big on this and everything. So the reason why I'm
Guys, so
opposed
sorry.
to that,
I'll be right back. Sorry.
the reason why I'm opposed to that type of legislation is because, to me, that the consequences of being for that type of legislation seems to be much more likely the case that it's going to reinforce these notions that people have, that it's okay to commodify animals, that they're here for us to use. And so that means that while in the current uh, systems where animals are currently living, yes, obviously the conditions in those particular facilities is going to be better for those animals, but that's ignoring the countless generations of animals that are going to be bred and put into facilities that are doing horrible, cruel things to animals, just in with 2 bigger inches or whatever it is, 2 bigger feet. And so that's why I'm opposed to that legislation, because it ignores the much what I see as much greater harm down the line by giving reinforcing this green light that animals are here for us to use. Now, what would change in my mind is, I took a couple of notes here. Let me just evidence would change my mind, right? Evidence which would show that the the psychology evidence which would clearly show that the psychology of the public is no different than what was demonstrated in the responses that were alluded to, that I alluded to earlier, the women's magazine. And to me, the reason, so that to me is evidence that by pushing certain welfare legislation, that people are going to either continue eating eggs without guilt or going back to eating eggs, because some of the responders had stopped eating eggs because there was this controversy. There was some controversy about this, but once the legislation was passed, some of these responders says, well, now I'm going back to eating eggs because now everything's okay for the animals. And and I'm paraphrasing that. So if it can be demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that human psychology would be very different than what it is, then I could maybe sign on to welfare legislation. But so far, it seems that human psychology is exactly aligned with what these responders responded in this women's magazine. And you have to demonstrate to me that these respondents were somehow purposefully selected for a particular agenda. I don't think that's the case. I think they just took respondents who responded to this question that they posed, and that it seems to demonstrate just a normal human psychology. Now, I've seen no compelling evidence provided that demonstrates that human psychology would be different than what was reflected in this women's magazine poll. So I think the burden is on the people who say no, that human psychology would definitely be different. I think the burden is on those folks who to demonstrate that human psychology is different than what seems to be reflected in my experience with humans, but also what's reflected in the respondents in this women's magazine.
I think Pablo had a response to that.
Yeah, just quickly. I mentioned it before, but I think maybe we should consider it, all of us. Like, maybe it's not a good strategy to focus so much on the psychology of people, because what matters in the end are the victims, are the animals. And it feels to me like many vegans take this strategy as their main the main activity they do, which is to try to convince people of something, of changing their mind. And I think in the end, we should probably just take any strategy that works. And when you see the data, you see that actually there is less meat being consumed by people, regardless of why that happened, right? Like, I really wish, as I said before, that it was easy to change people's minds on this topic, but I think it really is very hard. So to me, as I said before, I have realized, and the data sort of backs that up, that asking people to reduce their meat consumption is a good strategy, even if I, again, wish that they could just go 100% vegan. So I'm actually interested to know if you disagree on this. Like, I have, I think the evidence says that asking people for small things like reducing their meat consumption or just providing alternatives for people that they would be likely to buy in the supermarket is generally a better strategy than aiming at convincing people to totally change their mind.
So you were posing that specifically to me, Pablo?
No, well, I mean, you have mentioned several times psychology and changing people's the way that people think and so on, and that's why, yeah, it's a little bit more addressed to you. But I guess in general, I'm also interested to know everyone else's opinion.
Well, yeah, I'll just respond quickly, and then I see that Brandon is raising his hand. I'll let Brandon take that. So I have years ago, maybe 25 years ago. I mean, I've been involved in animal activism for more than 30 years. And so I think it was maybe 25 years ago, something like that. I had read some studies that some welfare organizations were putting forward as we are going to kill the abolitionists with this study. And the claims were made in the study that, that these welfare legislations were the reason why there is less animal consumption in certain places, whatever. But the problem with those studies was that they didn't have like sufficient controls, right? These studies, and I don't remember the names of these particular studies, but I think there were two of them that were boasted about and bragged by these welfare organizations. They didn't sufficiently control for things such as activism, animal rights activism or animal abolition type activism. So you would have to control for important things like that in order to come up with a claim that the reason why there is less meat consumption, whatever, is because of our welfare legislation. So I'm open to seeing data and information. I mean, that's what I'm basing everything on, is data and evidence and information. I just haven't been presented with good evidence or good arguments counter to my position, but I'm very much open to seeing it. I just wish there would be compelling arguments against the position I'm holding.
Okay, if I could, couple things. So, the reason why I say all this is kind of speculation, because Lewis, I mean, I find it interesting, right, how you say that the welfare studies, and again, I believe, I'm going to take your word on it, but I find it interesting how you say the welfare studies didn't have controls, they didn't factor things like vegan activism, but the poll in a woman's magazine is somehow good enough evidence to support, that you're using in this conversation. I find that kind of contradictory, right? So I think when we're looking at evidence, we should have a consistent threshold of evidence. And an anecdotal poll in a woman's magazine that hasn't been peer reviewed, that I'm assuming can't even source, right? Because you haven't sent a link or you haven't shared. If you could source it, I would love to take a look. But if we're, I could say that I read in a men's magazine 25 years ago that, 1 out of 2 people stop being vegan, after 3 years or so. Like people do that all the time, where they just they make statistics up, or they read statistics incorrectly, or there's other confounding factors that they don't bring up that were mentioned. I'm not saying you're doing that necessarily. I'm just saying that it's hard for me to take the evidence that you're providing, a poll in a woman's magazine where also it's only one demographic, it was women. So again, it's hard to know what exactly was mentioned in that poll, what the context was, who it was directed towards, because we don't have it, we don't see it, it wasn't peer reviewed. So that, I don't take as good evidence. And again, I feel like there's this approach there's this idea of you have to be one or the other. You either have to be a welfarist, like you mentioned a study where the welfarists are going to take down the abolitionists. that's not what we're talking about. We're all abolitionists, I'm assuming. And while I might disagree with something you say, Lewis, or even with Pablo, like I disagree with the reducitarian approach, just because I have hardline principles, I would say that we're all vegan. We all want to see animals liberated. We want to see animals freed, right, or the end of animal exploitation. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? We can support, or at least not oppose, right? Because there's a difference between actively supporting and actively opposing. We could at least not oppose welfare reform that it will be at least better for animals and still keep our message on abolition, right? I think if we're looking at nuance, if we're looking at like what has made more vegans and what has got us to where we are now in terms of animal rights and veganism, it's probably a combination of everything, right? It's probably a combination of welfare laws, of vegan activists having conversations, of factory farm documentaries. All of these things, like one of the earliest memories I have as a 6-year-old was watching an HBO documentary where a slaughterhouse worker was talking about how the workers were, assaulting turkeys, right? I remember this clear as day. It's one of the first memories in my mind, was watching this documentary, and I shouldn't have been watching it. I was home alone. I was a kid, but I'm glad I did, because one of the earliest memories was knowing how awful humans can treat animals, right? Like sick, awful, shit that happens. And that stuck with me. I remember that when I started learning about veganism, when I started looking into what I was eating, what I was wearing, my choices, that always stuck with me. Right? So it's hard to know what is going to actually wake people up and make people care about the issue. Even people like I've had somebody on my channel who I've debated. He's like a friend in real life, who he says he agrees. There's no justification for what we do to animals. Animals are sentient. It's way better to be vegan, but he just doesn't care. He wants to eat his McDonald's. He wants to use Taco Bell. He just doesn't care, right? So even somebody who can at least verbally, I don't know what there's no way for me to know in his head, but at least verbally communicate agreement with my position, he doesn't care enough to change. So it's hard to know, and he's eating the worst. He's not even buying. It's not like he cares a little bit. He's eating factory farmed, tortured animals. He's wearing leather. So I think any approach, unless we have really hard evidence to think otherwise, any approach that is for animals, whether it's welfare reform, whether it's liberation, whether it's whatever factory farm footage, we should not oppose it. I don't see a good reason to oppose it.
Well, I'd like to posit also, though, is who is enforcing these laws that are passed. My experience, I've worked with a lot of illegal fishing. We've boarded a lot of illegal fishing boats. We've been to a lot of different areas. I've been to a lot of black markets internationally. And my experience is nobody enforces it. So there are no USDA inspectors there every day. There is nobody watching. In my experience, animal welfare laws lead to additional exploitation because there is no enforcement and there's no money put into enforcement. And this is, I think, the big scam of it all, is that they're passing these knowing that they don't have to make too much change. We run into it in almost everything. So to me, it's, I don't necessarily believe in the structure enough to believe that they're going to enforce these animal welfare laws. So that's kind of one issue that I do have with, if we keep the farm open, to me, we failed as vegans. We need to close the farm. We need to shut it off entirely. I know that things change more and more as it goes on now. But I do think that we need to just keep fighting for this ideal that even might seem like it's out of our reach. We can reach it. It's interesting because I really like what Pablo said. And actually, I agree with you guys for the most part in entirety. I became vegan because of cancer. So, like your friend, Brandon, that the moment he gets colon rectal cancer, his tune's going to change, and I can guarantee you that, because that's what changed me. And then I found my consciousness through my actions. So mine's a little bit backwards than most guys that come to a consciousness revolution inside of them and then change. So no matter how it happens, it will happen over time. But I think we have to build walls and not bridges. And I do think incremental change is important, not legally, but mentally. To say to somebody, just try Meatless Monday. Yeah, I mean, go try an Impossible Burger. There's a lot of arguments on that. But if you have a transition food that can pull somebody away from a slaughterhouse, let's make that our first step. So I do believe that we're all on the same page and that there are short-term incremental, but we also need to never allow those to give up our long-term, what seemed like maybe unreasonable or unreachable goals, but we have reached them. So as vegans, I do believe that no matter what, it's either shut down the farm or we don't have a victory yet.
I agree. No debate there. I think the message should always be shut down the farms, shut down the factories, whatever it is. 100%. Yeah, no disagreement there.
I'm sure we're probably all in agreement.
Carson, your mic, Carson.
I forgot that I had muted it. I wanted to comment something to Eric, but I'm not part of the debate, so it's nothing to respond to, just something to ponder. And you guys can talk about it if you want. But then after that, I also have a challenge to Lewis, like I did for Brandon a second ago. But Eric, something to think about when it comes to the idea of laws not enforced, which is complicated. But like so. If you look at in the U.S. in 1963, slavery was abolished, and then 1863, and then in the 1880s, black men got the right to vote, and then in 1920, women in the U.S. got the right to vote. But it wasn't until closer to the 1960s that it was enforced in a way where in half the country, most black people, even though legally it was on the books, the making it be enforced didn't happen till then. But you have to go in order. You can't go out of order. You can't say, oh, well, since they're not going to enforce it and therefore they're not going to let black people vote, then we might as well not give black men the right to vote in the 1880s when they did, or black women the right to vote in 1920. You can't not give... You can't not create a law and then try to have the law that's not there enforced. I think you do have to go in order. I think the idea is if something should be a law, work towards it being a law. If a law is not enforced, then work towards it being enforced. And I just think that's something worth thinking about.
Real quick, though, I'd like to distinguish that all of those examples are not welfare examples; they're rights examples, and rights are definitely a little bit more complicated, and people have to fight for them, but generally more enforced than welfare enforcement, which comes under the jurisdiction of generally best management practices.
Yeah. So like if let's say parents were allowed to beat their kids or something, and do it like when they were in trouble or whatever, and then you have a law going through saying like, you can't do this. So you basically creating a welfare thing for them, even if it's not going to be enforced. Like nobody's in there watching to see if they're going to be beat. They're going to believe a parent over a kid or whatever. You still put the law through, and then you work towards enforcing. But it's just a thought, something worth thinking about. But also, I think when it comes to figuring out what's right or wrong, it's good to hypothetically just look at it as like different issues. There's should there be a law, and then should laws be enforced? But I just want to throw that out there. It's not a huge deal. Lewis, to see how much of it's based on human psychology versus outcomes, I'm curious if over the next 100 years, in the UK, they were to try a whole bunch of push welfare stuff through, and then after 100 years, it were to turn out that like 95% of the UK became vegan, and maybe even almost all factory farming was completely illegal, and we saw this process happen. And then let's say that you were born into that time. So you were born like 80 years from now. So you're 20 years old when you see this outcome. And then you can look back over history and go, oh, in the US, there's still only 1% vegan. All this is going on. But in the UK, we can see that the more welfare that was pushed led to this outcome that Pablo and Brandon are saying might be likely. Would seeing an outcome like that, I don't know if numbers matter or type of people or anything like that, but in the UK right now, there's 68 million people, so I don't know if that helps any. If you were to see this, just with what I'm giving you now, without any external information, just seeing a wild amount more of welfare laws are pushed through, and then the outcome happens to be almost unanimously vegan, would something like that be enough for you?
No, not necessarily, because it doesn't demonstrate causation. It demonstrates, at best, correlation. We would have to understand what other factors could potentially result in that change, right? So we would have to rule out everything else, and that's why before, when I mentioned those studies that I'd looked at, 25 years ago, whatever, they didn't sufficiently control for that type of thing. So the best they can come up with is correlation, not causation. So I wouldn't necessarily assign some sort of, a victory to animal welfare legislation just because of that, because it wouldn't have demonstrated causation. It would have demonstrated maybe correlation.
But
What if
would
it
that
was
matter that much? Like, if we see in the end that there is fewer animals being killed and there is less factory farms and so on and so forth, like, what else could it be, right? Like, would it just happen by chance? No. What Carson was pointing out is, if there was all these regulations, these welfare changes, incremental changes over time, making better and better conditions for animals, and for a very complicated causal, with a very complicated connection of facts that go one after the other. For whatever reason, it turns out that there's less suffering in factory farms, and compared to the US, where these things didn't happen, where these welfare improvements did not happen. In the UK, I mean, that's the example that he put, they did happen, and now there is fewer animals suffering in factory farms. Would that be good enough evidence, or would you not think maybe it's a good thing to try to have better welfare for animals? I think that's more or less the situation that Carson was depicting, right?
Well, it could be any number of factors, right? The burden is on the people who are claiming that it's because of animal welfare legislation. That's their burden to demonstrate. And so I want to see compelling evidence that it's causally related, not casually related. And so just as one point of possibly numerous points is that in England, there is a lot of abolition activism going on, right? And there's people like Joey Armstrong and others who are going on mainstream media broadcasts and talking about this issue. So you would have to, as somebody who's making the argument that this is causally related to welfare legislation, you'd have to control for all those other factors. And if you can sufficiently control for that, then yes, I would be willing to say, okay, then there seems to be sufficient evidence that welfare legislation, or at least the type that was put forward, during that time, seems to be something that would be beneficial to the animals. But that's the burden that the people are making. If they're making that claim, if somebody's making that claim that it is due to animal welfare legislation, it's your burden to prove that.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is, like, you could just bake it into the hypothetical, right? So you could just bake it that it is proven, right? It's not correlated. It is it's linked. It's causally linked, right? So if you bake it in that, I think what Carson's trying to test, and what I'm also interested in, is if you have a threshold to where you would actually change your mind, right? Because that's a sign of a good faith debater, a sign of somebody who actually, cares about the truth and wants to actually better their position, right? So, and you answered it before I had to ask. So yeah, you're saying that if it was causally linked, that over time, little by little welfare reform led to more vegans or more of a mindset change, then you would be in support of that. But it would have to be sufficiently demonstrated to be causally linked. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in correlation to that, it would have to be shown that we're not reinforcing these notions about that it's okay to commodify animals and use them.
Well, assuming that more vegans are being made, that wouldn't be the case. But yeah, you could just bake it in the hypothetical. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, if all these things are baked into the hypothetical, then sure, then I
Yeah.
could say, okay, yeah.
See, for me, there is no way that just welfare reform is going to lead to more vegans, right? And again, speculating, right? Obviously, in a hypothetical, blah, 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 yeah, I'd sign off. But speculating on real world outcomes, I don't think there's any way. I think we can support, I think we need to push and support everything we can. And that's just depend on the individual. Like I said, I didn't go vegan because I cared about animal welfare or I cared about, like, emotionally what the animal's going through or empathetically. I went vegan because it was a logic thing, right? I care about, not seeing humans exploited. Well, humans and animals aren't different enough to care about one but not the other, therefore I'm vegan, right? So that's why the type of activism I do is centered around that, because that's what works for me. I can communicate what works for me the best compared to trying to fake, advocate for something else. Whereas someone else who went vegan after seeing Dominion, guess what they're going to go out and advocate, right? They're going to go out and try and share, hey, look at this awful treatment. Look at what the animals are going through on your behalf. Why are you supporting it? Right? So different strokes for different folks. And I think every kind of branch we tear off from the vegan tree or the potential, vegan tree, I think is doing a disservice to the animals when we don't have that sufficient evidence. And again, to your point, Lewis, it's got to be causally linked. And unfortunately, I mean, the egg study in the Women's Magazine, you just wouldn't be able to demonstrate that it's actually causally linked. There could be other confounding factors. So, to tear off that branch based off of something that we don't know for certain, I think has the potential to do more detriment than harm with what we know.
Pablo, did you? I saw Pablo raise his hand. I wasn't sure if he's going
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably, I don't know if everyone is kind of disagreeing with me, but to me, the goal has never been to make vegans win, because I have heard some of you saying this kind of wording, like if we don't manage to avoid 100% of animal exploitation in the long term, then vegans would have failed. I think Eric said that at some point, or something along those lines. And now also Brandon has said something that sounded a little bit like that. And I don't like phrasing things like that because it feels that it puts the focus on the vegan movement as if we are sort of the victims, that we are trying to achieve something and we are failing. I think at the end of the day, really, we need to look at the victims, the animals. And I really don't care what it is that leads to the reduction of meat consumption to a minimum. I just want that to happen. So if nobody in the world really cared about animals, but for whatever reason, we figured out technology very quickly. Like, we actually have the technology to produce cultured meats, for example. We just need to scale that by a lot. So if we reach that point where we actually have these technological solutions and everybody's eating that meat and they eat as much as they want, I am perfectly happy with that. And I would not really care I think there could be some bad consequences if people never make this connection, because, maybe there is some other topic where now people start exploiting other people or other, I don't know, or maybe people do not care about the wild animal suffering, which is also a very big topic. I think it's important that people learn about the suffering that was involved during factory farms. But if we end up just not having it for whatever reason, I think that would be a success. I just
Yeah.
want to point that out. I don't know if
Well-
everybody agrees or disagrees on the.
Yeah, I want to point it. I want to say something just because if this were a formal debate and it was two people on an exact stance versus two people on an exact opposite stance, and it mattered how equal that was, I would keep my thoughts completely out. But since this is more of a conversation and there's people on different fences, I'll go ahead and I think everybody knows my position, but I'm going to share it anyways because Pablo made the comment about it not knowing if anybody agreed with him, and I wasn't familiar with any of his thoughts until this, but I've never heard anybody that I agree more 100% with on approaches than Pablo. So you do have somebody that definitely agrees with you here. I personally, if I had to predict with humans, I hope this is not the case, but I can't picture any time in the next million years that legally everyone will be forced to be vegan. So I can't imagine that ever existing. I just think it's so unlikely, and that's a current guess of mine. So therefore, my stance is I want every possible legal right there can be in any measurable amount to benefit animals, to have them not suffer as much as possible. And so that's why I have the stance I have on this.
I'd like to, if I may, just bring in one more time the idea of animal rights. And yeah, Pablo, I was saying that, and I do firmly believe that. I firmly believe that as long as we keep a farm open, even if we can fix one aspect of 10 bits of cruelty, although it is better for the animal, it's not better for the next generation of them that know no different. And the difference is I'm not so much a vegan advocate because vegans tend to be focused mostly on only factory farm animals. I'm also focused on animals exploited in labor industry, entertainment. I've seen like monkey poaching firsthand in the Amazon and the black market for the illegal pet trades. So there's a lot of exploitation, all of which have welfare laws already. So to me, although it may be a great step in the right direction, it's only using 1% of our ability and our kindness to where it could really go further. Like I said, in England, they have actually banned a lot of animal exploitation. And I know as vegans, that's what we all want. So I do stand that, animal rights is a more, like, if I have 5 hours in a day, I'm definitely going to try to convince people that animals deserve better. Now, whether that ends up in a formation of welfare or rights in their minds, I think that's something that all 5 of us do have in common. Like Carson said, it's been actually an amazing conversation over a debate. And when it comes to proof, what proof would I need to change my mind that animal welfare works? I would need proof that animals are not sentient. Because if they spend one moment in any of these situations, it's a cruelty that I personally feel I have failed them, and I will defend and try to fight for them to the very last day, whether it's a factory farm animal or an animal in a zoo. But animal welfare allows zoos to stay open, it allows fur farms to stay open, it allows cruel dairy farms to stay open, it allows fish farming to stay open and aquaculture. Which is destroying the actual environment. So again, for me, I just want to put back out there that I stand firmly behind the concept that animals have fundamental and deserve and need fundamental rights, which I think would be an interesting debate on should they have human rights or should they be out of the legal system entirely?
Eric, can I bring a challenge? Eric, can I bring a challenge to you? Now that the cat's out of the bag and I have shared my stance, this is a challenge I bring to anybody on the anti-welfare side. So imagine right now some scientist figures out how to how to save farmers all kinds of money on farming cows. And how they figured this out is they figured out that they can chop off the legs of all farmed cows and they sew them up. They're all stitched up and they can put them on shelves in a factory. So they don't need they can go high up. They don't need a big field, no grass, none of that. And they all just have an IV pumping what's needed to keep them alive and grow them fat. Okay. They're alive. They're sentient. They're just like normal cows. They're just in a black room staying alive for like 4 years. The most misery, I'm guessing realistically, it's not even baked into the hypothetical. This would likely be the most miserable existence a cow could have is what I'm describing. Okay. And so they figure out this will save farmers endless amounts of money. They'll be able to make cheap meat for everybody, all this stuff. And then there's some concern that maybe people wouldn't accept it. Maybe they would. And so they're going to put it to a vote. So tomorrow it's going to be put to a vote by the citizens of whatever. And you're one of the citizens. And the vote is either to let farms do this. Let farmers go, yeah, we're just gonna put cows' legs off, most misery ever. Or we're gonna say, no, this is illegal. We're not gonna let them do this. We'll just let them keep doing the current standard factory farming. Okay? And let's say it's not tomorrow, actually. It's like 2 weeks from now. And from what you hear, it's like a 50-50 shot if this is going to go through or not. And you getting out and getting 100 or 1,000 people to go vote to stop this is what's going to make this happen. So my question to you is, do you say all use of animals is bad, and so this is just as bad as any other, so I'm going to focus on animal liberation? Or do you say, I'm not going to sleep at all. I'm going to get out there and spend every second I can making sure this law does not pass. So it's kind of it's a welfare hypothetical in the opposite direction. Instead of making the lives better, it's preventing worse lives. So anyways, what's your answer to that?
So, if you don't mind, I'd like to actually take that hypothetical and make it a real debate that I've had with people. And this is the Army use of live goats and pigs for surgery practice in the field. And they will cut them, chop a leg off. They'll do all kinds of cruel things to these animals to allow field medics to learn how to stitch up in there. And this is something that's going on. It's not hypothetical.
Wow.
So I'd like to take it out of factory farming for a moment and bring it to a real problem that we're actually facing. And there was a big movement. What do we do? Was the movement question. Do we have them stop treating the animals this way, or do we try to ban this form of exploitation? So I don't know if it's okay to move animal testing and equate that to animal factory farming. To me, it is. Again, because I'm come from animal rights. So the question is, what do we do, right? Like, we have this situation where they're in terrible, terrible situation, and it's going to get incrementally better for them. So not chopping off their legs. That removes part of the cruelty. My kindness instinct says, absolutely, we have to treat them better. But my true side says to myself, this needs to be a larger conversation where maybe we can whip this into a frenzy to try to ban it. Like we try to ban animal testing. We don't say it's okay if the animals get a cookie when they're done being tested, that it's okay. We stop animal testing. And to me, that is the true vegan perspective. So as a vegan, I would say we need to shut this farm down. And maybe we can. Do what I say that the legislation's bad? No. Because obviously anything that's less suffering is great, but less suffering is still suffering. And as a vegan, I'm not totally down with promoting or allowing continuing suffering. And this would allow continuing suffering in other ways. They'd be hooked up to the things. They'd be in pitch black. They have an instinct. They're sentient. They know what they're supposed to be doing. And the cruelty of them being inside of anything structure is so cruel that I don't know if the legs would make a big enough of a difference to save them from going through all the stress, pain, and cruelty that they do.
Gotcha.
There's sentient knowledge for them.
Brandon, are you going to challenge him further on this same topic?
Yeah. I just wanted to
Okay.
clarify. Eric, I think I appreciate where your message, I think, is correct. I think there's a misunderstanding because nobody's, like, in the hypothetical, nobody's saying that you can't keep advocating for ending all the farms or ending all the exploitation. You can keep doing that. We're just talking about an instance where, as you're still fighting for the end of all animal exploitation, you also have the opportunity to prevent either worse treatment for animals or to improve or to implement change that betters the treatment of animals. But it's not like, oh, okay, if I advocate for the better treatment of animals with this one law, that means I have to stop asking for all the farms to be closed. No. Keep doing that. So, like, no, in this, like, from my position is to not, like, stop doing that and then only advocate for the better treatment or to prevent the worst treatment. It's, okay, we have the opportunity to vote. We can make things slightly better. We can move things either in this, in the right direction a little bit. Let's do that. But we're not done. We still have more to do. We got to shut everything down. We got to keep pushing. This is why this is still wrong. This is why that's still wrong. So, yeah, it's not an either or situation. You could do both.
Well, I'm curious though. That Lewis really made me think about this earlier. What about the unintended consequence though of saying now the cows are comfortable and we're okay? So are we just continually allowing the industry go on as was previously by coming up with different excusatory law? Or are we saying, let's just shut this down? Like, will this affect, and I know it goes back to the debate we couldn't fully figure out, will this affect people's psychology to where they're now okay with it and don't find the need that we need to shut it down because it's already been handled by the law?
Well, but that's the question, right? That's the age-old question, right? Is this going to actually, but again, given the evidence we have, I would say that improving the experience of the victims, for me, outweighs the potential that people might be, like, less adamant about going fully vegan and just, buying the humane things, right? And again, separate from the humane washing, because it's just hard to say, right? It's hard to say because I know, like, Natalie Fulton, I don't know if you're familiar with Natalie Fulton, but she did this whole campaign in Colorado about trying to shut down a goat, or I think it was a sheep slaughterhouse, or it was something, right? Something with slaughterhouses. And them even advocating for this law, every conversation was a vegan conversation. So every conversation they were asking questions about how animals should be treated and that they're sentient. And so it's even in that regard, in one way, yes, having a label of, RSPCA approved or, humane, whatever, yes, that may have one negative impact in terms of, like, on the consumers. But at the same time, bringing up the fact that we're even thinking about improving conditions for these animals can also go the other direction. It can spark interest or spark curiosity as to, why are we trying to improve the conditions for these animals? Is there any value in animals outside of humans? So I think it's just hard to say for sure,
It's a great point.
Well, and I don't trust the idea of anything involving human psychology at all. I mean, we have to, understanding human psychology does help us with a lot of things, but I think that's the importance of laws. Is like most people in the U.S. right now, if it all of a sudden became legal to own slaves, like let's say it became legal to own black people in the U.S., most people aren't going to do that. But
a lot of people
it
would.
should be illegal is because some people would, yeah. And so I think that's why, like, I don't care if human psychology changes. I don't care what the human psychology tells us. I don't care if getting this message makes humans think this way or that way. That's why I think we shouldn't leave it up to the human minds at all, outside of the idea of the human mind being involved in voting and laws. But getting a law going through, I feel like, is everything. It's every little thing. So one thing that I think is kind of interesting, because Eric, I am curious to hear your answer to the the cow one. I do like the thing you brought up as well, but I think the cow one just makes it really simple, and it's also not unrealistic. We figure out new things all the time, and people want to make money and don't care about animals. So my question, it still stands. Would you try to convince people to do this thing? But then also imagine yourself like at a table where you're out in a public area trying to get people to sit down and talk with you about it so you can encourage people to vote for it. I don't even know if it would be good to talk about the vegan message at all in a case like this. I think if people sit down and you're like letting them know like this leg cutting off thing is an option, you should not vote for it. You guys can talk about the thing, and then they can hop up and go, and the next person, and you could try to talk all these people into this very important law. Or you tell them about it, and then they're all like, yeah, I'm against this suffering. I'm going to vote against it. And then before they leave, you say, do you think you could become vegan? And they go, no. And then you go like, oh, well, you shouldn't even care about these cow legs at all then if you're not going to go vegan or whatever. So anyways, I'm just curious to hear your answer, and if that last part makes you think of it differently, go for it.
Definitely. Again, in my experience, animal welfare laws are not enforced.
We'll just say hypothetically they're enforced.
Okay.
Because I mean, there's no point to talk about the conversation if they're not.
This is one of my reasons that I would not be so excited about this law. But if I had to sit down and talk to somebody, and again, I very rarely even mention that I'm vegan when I debate things with people. It comes from more of a realm of animal conservation that I work in. What I would sit down and talk to them about would be the same thing. Whether you're pro or anti, you think it needs more. The problem is the suffering, right? So we know that we can connect with everybody that we talk to when it comes to suffering of animals. Nobody wants to see that. Even people that like to eat burgers say they do not like the idea of animals suffering. So we have the animals suffering there. What would I do? I would try to spend my time trying to make more of a speciesism argument that we need to move away from this. If somebody's telling me they're still going to eat beef, whether they have legs or not, that is, to me, that's more of the obstacle of what we're looking for. I think it's a little bit of a broader thing to sit down and talk about the suffering and to talk about what should we do, and I would rather make that conversation turn into let's picket this place until it shuts down, like we have with fur farms. And let's use this emotional connection to our animals to push for a bigger cause. Would I vote for it? Yes, because obviously any less suffering is the only kind humanistic approach. Any less suffering, you would be put in that situation. But again, I do bring up Lewis. I don't know if I would convince other people to vote for it because, as Lewis says, maybe the unintended consequence is that they now think there's an adult in the room and it's been handled and we're all good, and that is something that really, we have to consider. So I'm at a crossroads when it comes to this topic because I want to see less suffering, but I don't know if being a big advocate of something that may not be enforced, and maybe we're missing the mark by still saying it's a conservation issue as an environmental issue. It's the animals are here for human use, so let's make it better for them is one way to see it. Animals are here for the world use. They're keystone species. They're not here for us is a totally opposite argument, and an animal welfare law would not support a hands-off, the animals are not here for us approach.
Okay, and just for sake of debate and conversation, let's just assume that laws will be enforced just for the sake of conversation. I think the idea of them not being enforced is its own thing worth talking about, but I think it makes it harder to discuss. But Pablo, did you have a response to him?
No, I just wanted to say that it feels like, to me, the situation that Carson depicted is like you have these very low-hanging fruit, right? Like this way to reduce animal suffering tremendously by a huge amount. That's what he described. And I'm a bit surprised that, Eric, even if you're saying that you want to do that as well, but you have put so much like you're so unsure about it. I think like to me it's clear, like obviously it's not a perfect solution, but strategically, as I've mentioned before, like we are dealt a bunch of cards. They're not the perfect bunch of cards. You would probably have others, but we have to play them in the best way possible, right? And what Carson is saying, in this very specific scenario, you have the chance to just focus on this very specific intervention that is going to reduce animals suffering by a big margin, even if it's an imperfect solution. So to me, I think we should be a little bit more aligned in saying, yes, if we find these kinds of low-hanging fruits, we should definitely take them.
Eric, if you want to respond, I do want to respond to Pablo, what he said earlier about the vegans winning or whatever, but I'll let you, Eric, if you have a response.
Sorry, I really quickly, I don't mean to dominate the conversation, guys.
No, you're good.
This is such a fun conversation. Although, I would like to also reflect that, I don't know, I 100% actually agree with you. Also, though, in my experience, we've busted a lot of poachers, whether it's illegal fishing, monkey poaching, things like that. And the problem with low-hanging fruit, though, is very often there are victories we can celebrate, but don't change the course of the way things go. And I know that it's maybe not the same thing to equate. But as a conservationist, we're in the field and we arrest people that are poachers. It doesn't actually do anything. And so the majority of the time, low-hanging fruit victories don't create the type of impactful change we need. Saying that, though, I will say that I do agree with you that if this particular happenstance, this instance, with Carson saying that the laws would be enforced and there'd be less suffering, I would still use, I do agree with you, though, that we do have to look at anything we can do to make animals better in this world.
All right, now if I can respond to Pablo, I do agree with Pablo's position of what ends the animal exploitation practices, right? So meat, leather, entertainment, testing, whatever it is. I'm in favor of, right? So from the victim's perspective, whether it's a law, whether it's new technology, whether it's a mindset change, I could care less. If animals are no longer exploited, that's a win to me. But when we're talking about humans, right? When we're talking about, okay, like the tricky thing, and Pablo mentioned this a little bit, but the tricky thing with not having people view animals as individuals or not having people view animals as deserving moral consideration is because any day they can flip, right? So any day tomorrow they can flip, the World War II for animals could happen tomorrow, right? If people don't actually view animals as deserving of that moral consideration that they're given by the technology, by the law, whatever. But that aside, because I personally as long as women are treated equally, if let's say if half the population wanted to treat women unfairly and they don't because there's a law in place, great. I'm so thankful for that law, so that way women are actually treated equally and given rights. But as a fellow human, that's really concerning. And I would really want, in my activism or when I'm talking to others, my goal is to actually get them to try and think about why they don't view others as equals, why they should, how we can get them there, So that's, I think for me, a win for me is when I can tap into somebody's moral values or try and convince somebody that they're wrong or that they should change and align more in viewing animals as individuals. But for the animals, I'll take anything. I mean, from the victim's perspective, I'll sign off on anything. So, it's just going to depend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a couple comments I want to make. So on what you just said about the women being treated equally, yeah, I would rather there be equal laws for laws that we think should exist for how men and women should be treated, and have 50% of men have the mental state of wanting to treat them poorly, than have something like 90% of them want to treat them great, but there's no law. I would much rather have way more people want to treat them poorly but legally not be allowed to than be like, okay, that 10% or 5% can treat them horribly because there is no law, but we have more people that are good. I love people being good, but if people aren't going to be good, I would rather force all the bad people to not. And the easiest thing to make sure that you realize I'm right, and this isn't even really much of an opinion, is replace it with rape. Would you rather 5% of men be legally allowed to rape all the women they want, or have 50% of men want to rape, but because the law is there, they're not allowed to? I don't even think that.
Well, can I push back a little bit?
You can. This was my example of agreeing with you, but I might have agreed with you wrongly. So yeah, push back.
I think so, because so for me, what matters is the outcome, not really like the state. So, because in your case, right, you're just saying the law is in place versus having no law and doing percentages. You're not actually talking about the number of women being affected, right? So for me, I'm only in favor of something other than a mindset change if it means the actual end to exploitation, or if it means that less animals are exploited. I'm not in favor of a law just, like in your scenario, because, like, for example, I'll give you a couple pitfalls with your example. If 95% of men don't want to assault women, but 5% do, and there's no law, it's going to be a lot easier not only to defend the women, because everybody doesn't want that to happen. So the people who aren't in favor of that will defend women, from the 5%. But also, again, laws will naturally be put in place. Now, obviously, built in the hypothetical, we can, you could build a hypothetical where that's not the case. I'm just saying, in that example, it gets tricky, right? Because not having a law in place, but 95% of people not being in favor of assaulting women would probably lead to less assault of women versus having 50% want to assault women but have a law in place. So I
think it's possible due to the topic and due to how it can happen sneakily. But I think it'd be comparative to what we said earlier about slavery or whatever. Like, most people don't want slaves, but if the law wasn't there, there might be 5% of people out there that do want them, so they'd have them. But if 50% of people wanted them, but the law was no slaves, it would probably look exactly like it looks today, where there are no slaves, unless some people have some kidnapped people stuck in their house in some hidden cottage or something.
Yeah, it just depends on the hypothetical.
I agree with you on the outcome for sure. It's I think for the most part, it's going to be based on the outcome.
Yeah.
It's complicated. And then Eric, just a quick comment. It's nothing that needs to be replied to, but it can be. But you made a comment about poaching and comparing that to the cow thing. I think one thing to keep in mind is the reason poaching is what poaching is because it's illegal. So poaching is the word for an illegal act that they want to do because the thing they want to do is not allowed. And therefore, it's probably not going to happen much. I don't know what the numbers are, but however many cows are slaughtered to be eaten is going to be a wild number more than like however many monkeys are poached or like elephants for ivory and that kind of thing. And so in my mind, whatever is going to stop the most suffering is the most important thing to look into, which is why I would say, even though I want people to stop eating animals, I can't remember the last time I ate an animal. It was over 8 years ago. I think nobody needs to eat them. I would much rather convince all the people to go to regenerative farming over factory farming, or hunting over farming. And there's various different degrees of these different things where if these people are going to do these bad things, we want to cut down on where most of the suffering is. And so like if you look at all the people that aren't going to stop eating animals, the best way to convince to make less harm would be if you were to pick one animal they should stop eating. I think I have this figured out right, but I haven't looked at all the numbers. But chickens is where the number one suffering comes in. If you convince people to only eat beef instead of 50% beef and 50% chicken, the amount of suffering is insane. How different that is, and then, so it's not necessarily good. I'm not saying vegans should go out and have signs saying only eat beef, not chicken, but it's just something important in my mind. It's something important to think about, is to find out where most the harm is and then focus there. I would rather people stop eating chickens but keep eating the same amount of meat than I would want to close all circuses. There's just not many circuses left. So that's just, or like I would love to end bullfighting. Is bullfighting still a thing in Spain?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Like bullfighting should end, but I would much rather end factory farming and keep regenerative farming or hunting or whatever than to end bullfighting, because bullfighting is going to cause, I don't know what, maybe 100, 1,000 bulls harm a year, where other animals are in the millions. I'm going to stop my rambling, but I think something meant something in there, and go on, guys.
I think that was not rambling. It's a very good point, and I think by the sound of what Brandon was saying, and you as well, I think we are all sort of moving around the concept of consequentialist view. Like at the end of the day, whether there is laws or there is a majority of people convinced about a certain way of thinking, in the end, what matters is the outcome. And if there is more suffering, then something went wrong and the approach was wrong. And if there is less of it, then this strategy worked, right? And just another comment, which is probably not for this conversation because it would be a kind of a tangent, but that's a really interesting point about whether we should encourage people that are going to eat meat anyway to reduce on chicken or beef. I think that's an interesting conversation, but obviously not for this debate, but because there's also the environmental impact of beef. There's also fish and shrimps, crustaceans, that are eaten in much bigger numbers than chicken. So there's a lot of considerations there. So it's not crystal clear at all which one should be better, but that's a totally different conversation.
Yeah. Lewis, I realized you hadn't talked in a while. Eric, you can totally go next, but I just wanted to get Lewis back in if he wanted to get back in as well. But also, I do got to hop off here in a sec, which I'm guessing you guys do too, because we have been here about 3 hours. But Lewis, if you have any thoughts, or Eric, if you had that last thought, go for it.
Eric, if you want to just go quickly with your last thought, if I'll let you do that.
I was just going to say, with all the hypotheticals and quantifying and qualifying suffering, I know that at the heart of it, all of us want to see the end of suffering. So I don't believe there's a big difference between it, but I do think that as long as we keep our eyes on animal rights and giving back animals their autonomy and the respect that they deserve within the world, no matter what the approach we're taking is, then we're doing the right thing every day.
For sure.
So, there's a lot to say. Welfare, to me, pertains to conditions of treatment of animals, which pertains to suffering, right? And so, so that to me, that so when we focus on the suffering of animals, right, there are real serious potential problems to that. And by the way, consequentialism doesn't entail caring only about current suffering. Consequentialism can care about the impact on future animals, right? And so we have to keep this in mind about the so-called welfare legislation that we're proposing to support or not, which is the one about the cutting off the four legs of the cows. That's Carson's kind of hypothetical legislation here that's been put on the table by Carson. And I'm not convinced, actually, that we're all on the same page. And I say that because of some things that have been said here in this discussion, but more recently when Pablo was talking about this is an imperfect solution. When I think that it's not actually a solution at all to focus on the chopping off of the four legs of the animals, because the solution is the non-commodification of animals, focusing, our campaigns and language on that is where the solution lies. It's not to so I think, I don't know if we're on the same page, and maybe, Pablo after this can clarify what he meant exactly by this is an imperfect solution. But I think maybe we're not on the same page, because it seems like maybe Pablo is focusing or thinks the goal is, ending suffering, or something of that nature. But I don't necessarily think that is the goal of my veganism. And so, because if we're focusing on this legislation that seeks to demonize the chopping off of four legs, and and this legislation, I mean, typically these welfare legislations, the way they work, at least that I've always seen, is that they do demonize this particular thing that they're trying to get banned. They say, "Oh, this is the problem. We need to eliminate this. This is the problem. This is a humane legislation. This is what we should all be supporting." And animal welfare organizations are getting behind this. But the problem with that is that what the message that could be sent, and I think is often sent, is that, well, it's okay to chop off two legs or three legs or one leg, and that it's okay to terrorize animals, and it's okay for cruel transport and cruel branding and cruel intensive confinement and beating and abuse and cruel insemination practices and killing. So you're leaving all of that on the table by focusing on saying, oh, this is the bad thing that we need to address. We're saying that chopping off four legs is the bad thing. This is the humane way to go. And so my concern is that we're reinforcing these notions that it's okay to continue to commodify animals. And what that does for future generations of animals, it means that we're going to impose these burdens on these animals, because people are going to feel comfortable. I think it's clear to me, the psychology of humans, that people are going to feel more comfortable about exploiting animals if we're saying that, no, the problem is the chopping off of four legs, when we know that is when I know that is not the problem. The problem is the commodification and all these other horrible things that go along with it. And so if we're focusing and we're saying that, oh, this is the great thing to do, humane legislation, I'm not convinced that me supporting that type of legislation, depending on the wording and the framing of it, like if it could be framed and worded to include abolition language or something of that nature, I'm convinced that it actually could lead to more harm of animals in future generations. So I would not support it unless I can see specific context or language in it that talks about the entire aspect of seeing animals as resources.
Can I respond?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm going to step out for 1 sec. I'll be right back. Brandon, you should respond. And Pablo, I think you were addressed directly as well, so you should respond. I just want to let anybody know, if anybody does feel like they have to go due to time or whatever, you don't have to feel bad. Just
I got all day, baby.
Talk. Awesome, cool. But yeah, you guys should keep talking. I'll be back in like 2 minutes.
Okay, the only thing I was going to say, so I'm in agreement with Lewis to a certain extent. I'm not just focused on suffering or consequences. Because there's ways to exploit women without causing suffering, right? So I do think I base my values more on like hard moral principles. So I'm more of a deontologist, primarily, depending maybe, my threshold is like, because I know threshold deontology a lot of people don't like, but I think I'm a pretty firm deontologist, except for maybe certain scenarios. But yeah, so for me it's about firm moral principles and getting people to align with those principles primarily, or at the very least getting people to not participate in the actions that would go against those moral principles, right? So that's where I'm basing my values on. So yeah, I don't know. I've thought about consequentialism, and I think it's interesting. So I would love to talk with somebody more knowledgeable on that more. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, I have more hardline moral principles. That aside, couple things, Lewis. I think in the context of, let's say I wanted to advocate for a welfare reform, right? Like the chopping off the cow legs, right? I'm saying, okay, we should vote to not have the cow legs be chopped off, right? If my message was, hey, the problem is that the cows are going to have their legs chopped off, then yeah, I agree with you. But nobody is saying that, right? That's not at all what I'm saying when I say we should support welfare reform. What I'm saying is we're talking about things that are already like things that are being proposed, right? By a lot of it is even by non-vegans that are being proposed, right? So we're talking about like better welfare for animals that are currently being exploited. We can sign off and support that change, that incremental change, but still have our language be that of an abolitionist, still have our goal and message be that of an abolitionist, right? Because again, I feel like throughout this entire conversation, whenever we talk about welfare, there always seems to be this one or the other approach, when I'm just not seeing why that has to be the case. We have the ability to speak and advocate for the freedom of all animals, but also sign off and make their individual experience better in the meantime, right? So yeah, I agree with you. Nobody should ever, if there is welfare reform, should say, hey, actually, this is the problem. The problem is the problem is, not big enough cages, so let's just increase the size of the cages. That's not the welfare I'm talking about. Should abolitionist vegans support welfare legislation? And the other flip to the coin, because you mentioned, well, is this going to normalize, again, you mentioned this, is this going to get people to think, oh, well, the problem's been taken care of? The flip side to that coin, okay? So imagine there's a law being proposed that would improve the welfare of cows, right? What message does it send when nobody votes for that law? Right? What message does it send when there is a law proposed that would increase, right? So it would usually, right? I could build this in hypothetical, but even practically, it's going to cost farmers more money. It's going to it's going to require them to breed or sell less animals. It's going to put in a lot of monkey wrenches into their typical operation, right? So what message does it send when we don't band together and say we support this change for the better, right? Because imagine if every abolitionist in the time of slavery, when there was a law that said that where plantation owners couldn't feed their slaves to their dogs, right? That was a thing that happened. If there was a law put in that was being proposed, what if every abolitionist or every person who was against slavery decided to not support that, decided to not vote for that? Would we be anywhere where we are now? So that's what I'm thinking of is, what message does it send? Sure, yeah, you might have some humane washing. Sure, yeah, maybe some consumers, depending on the statistics, may choose to exploit animals just in that, nicer quote-unquote way. But on the flip side, have we considered the message it sends when we don't support even these small laws, even the low-hanging fruit, like Pablo put? Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, if I just would like to just kind of make it an opposition perspective to that, with what we already see in zoos. People assume that zoos, for example, are helping us animals that are disappearing. The AZA that runs zoos said, is it better for a bird to live with clipped wings in captivity than to die in nature in a shorter amount of time? Now, that to me is the big question that we're talking about here, because if you think, well, hey, they're in the zoos, they got this great life, everyone feeds them, why do they need to fly? We forget that they need to fly, and nobody is fighting for the rights of those birds to go fly anymore, because we all think that they're okay in their welfare captivity situation. So I just wanted to throw that out. I apologize. Pablo, I know you're about to speak.
No, it's all right. I think it's an interesting point. Just very quickly on the ontology versus consequentialism. I think that's a really interesting, but again, maybe a side topic. And very often when I talk to people in this topic, in terms of veganism and so on, or others, usually, even if they consider themselves the ontologists, usually when I ask them, so would you think that this was a right strategy or a bad one? they usually base the answer of that question on the consequences. In
Right,
which
on
case it
outcomes,
makes
yeah.
me, yeah, exactly. So in a way, it feels like the ontology is always, in a way, depending on what happens at the end as consequences, and therefore it's a little bit like it makes sense to me that we just start from the consequences from the very beginning. And in fact, I think that comes back to what Luis was saying. Like we started with uh, this premise that Carson put forward about like a new thing that is going to cause much more suffering all of a sudden, and we have the opportunity to avoid that. And Luis sort of disagrees with opposing to that because in the long term it's going to have worse consequences. And then if that's the case, I actually agree with Luis, right? But that was not inbuilt in the premise. What Carson was saying is that, or at least what I thought was implied, is that we vote for this law and this thing never happens, right? And therefore the consequences are better for the animals. But Luis is saying no, but maybe in the long term it turns out to be worse. Okay, if that's the case, then I would, right? I disagree with with what I just said, but obviously we need to take a stance at some point, and we have to make a prediction with the best of our knowledge. And given the premise, I think the right thing to do in terms of reducing suffering would be to avoid that law. So yeah, and another example on partial solutions versus final solutions, I would say is that wearing or enforcing people to wear a seat belt in the car is a solution that saves lives, but there are many other reasons why people will still have car accidents and die in the road. Like, but it's still a solution. Like, it's not perfect, and people still can die even wearing the seatbelt. But it's still when we see the counterfactual, whether like in one universe we enforce it and in another one we don't, and it turns out that the data says that when we enforce it, fewer people die on the road. So that's what I'm talking about with imperfect solutions. We could have something else that is better, but at least that particular thing seems to be working well. So, and the same applies to the example that Carson was depicting before.
Carson, your audio.
I keep doing that. Real quick, Pablo, somebody was asking if you do street epistemology, and if so, where?
If I do what,
you
sorry?
If you do talks on the street, or if you just do YouTube.
I organize local events here as well. Yeah.
Okay.
In my YouTube channel, I have only made a couple of videos related to the topic. So
Okay,
I want to do more in the future, but yeah.
Okay, and then Eric, somebody wanted to mention that the thing you were talking about with zoos and the clipping of wings, they watched that on your channel recently. I think they found the link to your channel through the post about this debate, which, by the way, anybody watching, the links to all 4 of the channels of these guys will be in the description as soon as I get that put up. A question came up that I wanted to bring up, and then, but I didn't want to get in the way of the conversation. So anybody that wants to respond to anything Pablo just said or keep that going, they totally should. But Pia said, and this reminded me of what Eric said about the clipped wings, and so the question is a cat happier living in an apartment for 18 years, or would she rather live 3 years and be able to do what cats naturally do? So it'd be the idea of like just some wild cat, maybe a bobcat or something, out in nature, but their lifespan's a lot shorter because of just dying of starvation or whatever. Yeah. So anyways, I'd be curious to hear all your thoughts on this, but I think this one might be directed more towards Eric, but I'm not sure. Oh, Eric's muted.
Yeah, thank you. Pia, that is a great question. I'm so glad you brought that up because it's a big challenge, you know, like let's think about it for a second and deconstruct it from a slightly different perspective. Would your house cat rather be outside alone, trying to figure it out, or be at home? Now, that's a domesticated pet. Very different, say, than a bobcat. Now, let's think for a bobcat for a second. Would a bobcat want to be captured and brought into a home, knowing what the instinct is? Now, some people may say that animals that are born into their particular form of exploitation don't know, but if we believe animals are sentient, then we believe that they do have a capacity to understand and remember and always walk with their instinct, regardless of their condition or situation. So it's a little, I think it's a slightly different example when it comes to a house pet or like a kitty, you know. Now, if you have a feral kitty, and of course they're going to want to be, they're going to want that safety, but is an animal being held from its intent and its nature a good thing, whether it's a cow in an industrial farm, a mink in a fur farm, a gorilla in a zoo, or an elephant in a show? My answer is they all deserve and need the respect to be free and to be themselves. They were put on earth for one thing, and that one thing was not to entertain us. So, but again, I don't know if house cats necessarily fit in because, you know, they've been bred differently. The same with like pet dogs. It's a different thing than saying, you know, does a gorilla, should a gorilla be in a zoo because the poachers aren't going to get it, versus should they live in the mountains and be free? It is a very compelling question. I'd love to hear what these guys think.
Yeah, and this is where, and again, I love to talk to somebody more knowledgeable, but this is where the deontology for me kind of is the main thing, because then we could talk about like humans in a matrix, right? Because, you know, there's an argument to be made where if you hook everyone up to a machine and feed them what they need to and give them a virtual reality where their life is perfect, that might be a better consequence than having people actually have to deal with disease, have to deal with, you know, the dangers of the real world, have to navigate their life. But typically I value freedom and I value reality more than just the consequences of like a matrix situation. So, but I agree with Eric, it's a domesticated animal. So it's not a fair comparison to the bird, for example. You know, birds are, now if we live in a hypothetical and we domesticated a species of bird, then yeah, I think it would be cruel to force them to fend on their own and get eaten in 2 days. You know what I mean? So I think for cats, I think the morally correct thing to do would be to stop breeding them and to care for the cats in our homes that we have while we have them, since they are domesticated animals. But yeah, if we're talking about like just the well-being of the individual, regardless of their reality, regardless of if they know better or not, then again, we could hook humans up to a matrix, never tell them otherwise, and their well-being would be significantly better. So it's hard to, argue from that perspective.
Yeah, I can also say what I think about it. I have 2 cats, and I'm really surprised that they have not jumped in front of the camera yet. They may at any point. And I think they live very good lives. And counterfactually, because I adopted them, they were already born. Maybe there is a debate on whether we should breed them or not, and I think that's a valid conversation. But at least in this specific case, I know that they have very good lives, and if they were in the wild, they would probably suffer of parasites, starvation, fighting with other animals, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think it's good to. I think their lives are worth living. There is the issue of what I feed them, and I started giving them a vegan diet for some time. They had some issues, that it's not totally clear if it was totally like 100% related to that, or they already had something. So we are doing a slow transition now, and we are trying things. I wish that there was more research on it. There is some. So I think it is possible. I am 100% sure that, we have put the man on the moon, and we have done a lot of things. I think we can probably handle and figure out a way to feed cats a vegan diet. We have managed to do it very well with dogs. I know that there are some differences, but conceptually, I think we just need to give them what they need. And they actually like the vegan food for the time that we were giving it to them. So I think it is possible. And there is also a cultured meat for pets sold in the UK since this year. So I'm really looking forward to having that here in Spain as well. So yeah, I think I don't see a strong point saying that having cats or pets in general is bad per se. It may depend on the specific case.
Gotcha. I want to comment really quick just on something that I've seen at least a dozen times in the chat here. a few months back, I'm sure some of you here know this. A few months back, so I've been vegan for 8 years, and a few months back, due to some health choices, I decided to add some fish, eggs, and honey into my diet, and that went on for a couple months. And I now, at first I took honey and fish out, but I kept doing eggs for a while. But now all of them are out. But there's a bunch. But I haven't made a video on it because I don't like to do things right away. I like to, let things. Make sure things are where they are before I make an announcement or whatever. And so I got a lot of hatred for the fact that I started consuming those things. I just wanted to mention that so people would be clear. I almost didn't want to mention it because I think it's important for all kinds of people all over the world to be fighting for animals. If you eat certain animal products, or if you ride horses, but you are vegan aside from riding horses or something, I think everybody should fight as much as possible for animals. And so I think it is good to have people out there going I'm not even vegan, but I want to stop people from doing this. Somebody could eat meat and eggs, but they don't eat dairy, and they want to spread the word on how horrible dairy is. So anyways, I didn't want to bring that up as a thing where it's you should keep hating everybody until they're vegan, but I did want to make it clear because I don't want people to think I'm eating something I'm not. So I saw a bunch of comments in there. I currently am back to full vegan, but even when I was eating those things, I thought I was doing an immoral act that I justified. And I just want to be straight up front about that. Okay, but yeah, does anybody have another comment on...
I think Lewis wanted to speak.
Eric, if you have something quick to say, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that working around the world with conservation groups, the majority of them are not vegan. The majority of people that fight for animal rights are not vegan, and it surprises me because I don't understand how you can quantify suffering or alter it or put it into categories. So to me, it's always shocking. So that's where I do most of my vegan outreach, is when I'm out in the field or way out in there with a bunch of people that are trying to stop illegal fishing and then turn around and eating fish. I just find it very inconsistent, but unfortunately prevalent.
Yeah, I can answer that really quick for you. I think I know the exact answer. I think, at least in the U.S., 80% of people are overweight. Nobody wants to be overweight. People are overweight because they're addicted to food. They can't stop eating it. It doesn't matter if it's Cheetos or Big Macs or whatever. It doesn't matter if it has animal products or not. They're eating the food because they love the taste and it's making them overweight. I can say that as an overweight person. I still got about 40 pounds to go. These people that care about animals, they're justifying this one thing because they have to do it. They feel that need to do it, while they don't feel a need to all the other things you are fighting for, poaching, monkeys, elephants, all these other things. If they're not doing it, they see it's wrong. If somebody was made to become vegan for a whole month and then they weren't eating animals and then they were looking into vegan related things, they'd be like, oh, fuck. Because they're not doing it, so they're not having to defend themselves. So if you look at orcas in captivity, you're not doing that, so you can look at it and go, oh, that's sad, and I'm not the bad guy, so yes, I judge that. I think that's a basic answer to why people are fighting with you to defend animals while still eating their Big Macs. Pablo, did you want to respond to that real quick? But I think Lewis was going to go right after that.
Yeah, I think Luis wanted to say something, but I wanted later to address this as well.
Oh, okay. Lewis, go ahead.
So yeah, I do want to respond to something that Brandon said previously, but I'll get to that after I respond to Pia's question about the cats. So I think it actually depends on the cat, him or herself. I've rescued more than 100 animals. I would probably say easily more than 100 animals over the decades. Quite a number of them being cats, and I've cared for all sorts of animals, not just cats or dogs, but rodents and other species too. And each one is different. So I don't know if I have a definitive answer on whether or not 18 years domiciled with humans is going to a particular cat happier than 3 years living in the wild. I think for some cats, it would make them happier to be living in the wild for 3 years rather than living domiciled. Whereas other cats that I've cared for, rescued cats, I've never had a cat that isn't a rescued cat. They would definitely seem to prefer to be indoors. They're terrified of the outdoors, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really dependent on the individual cat themselves. Now, the other concern, of course, that we should all be concerned about is what is so that pertains to the animal, the cat themselves, right? Being indoors or outdoors, does that make them happier? But we have to also be concerned about, well, if they're living outdoors, then maybe they're making the lives of other animals miserable, like birds or small rodents and things like that. So of course that, I don't know if that wasn't part of Pia's question, but it's something that we should all consider. Now, getting to what Brandon had mentioned earlier, in terms of, let me hear, I took some notes here. Okay, so Brandon had said that he, I don't know exactly how he phrased it, but he doesn't think that any welfare legislation frames their campaigns as this is the problem. I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's actually not true at all, at least not from my experience looking at wording of welfare legislation when I have. Now, I haven't looked at recent welfare legislation, let's say within the last decade or so, but previous to that, I was big into, looking and reading over welfare legislation and considering whether it's something that I should support. And I would say that all of those welfare legislations that I've looked at actually did frame the campaign as, yes, this is the problem. Now, of course, they wouldn't necessarily use that exact word, yes, this is the problem, but the framing of it clearly seemed to indicate that, yes, this is the problem, and we are here to solve the problem.
Can I clarify?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yes, I don't mean to cut it. I just clarify. So I wasn't saying that like welfare reform doesn't word things weirdly, or like I said, there is a lot of humane washing where they portray a false narrative and all these things. I'm saying as vegan activists, right? I'm saying as vegan activists, we don't have to do that, right? So we can sign let a welfare reform into place that betters the experience of animals while still advocating for the end of animal exploitation. So yeah, I agree with you. I think if there is a welfare reform, especially if it's proposed by like the industry, right? So if there's welfare reform proposed by the industry and they're wording things in a way that's like clearly in opposition to our goal, then yeah, I probably wouldn't support it. So it's also to a certain extent going to depend on the type of law, on what's being proposed. But for the most part, like I said, like with what's it called, Pro Animal Future, and like Natalie Fulton, again, I don't know if you're familiar, but that's not how they would word things, right? So they focus on the issue because it's politics, right? So like you can't necessarily show your hand when you're trying to make these incremental changes. If all these vegans who are trying to shut down one slaughterhouse actually said, hey guys, yeah, our goal is to actually get all of you to stop eating your meat and stop wearing your leather and stop doing this, nobody would ever show them the light of day. They'd call them crazy and they'd write them off, right? So you can't always show your hand. So while on the surface they may be focusing only on this one issue, especially if there are vegans involved, usually they have bigger plans and have a goal of animal liberation. But again, it's going to depend. So I agree with you to a certain extent.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, and if we're talking about activists, talking about campaigns that that they support or that they think that the public should support, sure, we can frame it in a very different way than the legislation frames. I was really only talking to how the legislation frames the quote unquote problem. And so, and also, you followed that up previously with a question. Let me see here about what message could be sent if the legislation is not passed. And so I would just say that it's going to depend on each individual who doesn't support the legislation. I don't know what they think, but I think what could be said is that if a legislation is not supported, then it just means that the legislation is probably legislation that doesn't address the concerns of the voters, right? For whatever reason. Now, it could be because it could be, it depends on what the specific legislation is, but I don't think that it necessarily means, therefore, that just because legislation isn't supported, it isn't passed, that somehow this means that I'm not sure exactly what your conclusion was, that if legislation isn't passed, but I don't necessarily think that it has to be one or the other. I think it could mean a number of different things.
Yeah, I could clarify that as well if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I meant was, by the flip side of the coin is, because you're concerned that if it gets passed, if it gets supported, then there's going to be more, or people are going to feel better about their choices. They're going to feel better about exploiting animals, which could be the case. Again, I can't say no for sure. What I'm saying is, on the flip side, when people propose a welfare legislation, right, they're saying, okay, it seems like people are concerned about how animals are treated, about the well-being of animals, about what we're doing to animals, right? So let's try and introduce something that's going to take profit away from the producer. It's going to make things more difficult, but let's see if people actually, raise the cost of these goods, but let's see if people care enough, right? Let's see if people actually do care about the well-being of animals. If nobody supports it, or if it doesn't get passed, or worse yet, if we oppose it, then I would speculate that in the future, it's going to be less likely, not only for things to get passed, but for more incremental change to be proposed, right? So if you can't even get the low-hanging fruit passed, why would anybody even go steps above that, right? Oh, okay, they can't even support not chopping cows' legs off and keeping them on IV. Why would we stop slitting their throats and giving them steaks? So I think that's what I meant, is when we don't support it, what kind of message does that send to the producers, to people who market for these animal exploiting companies? I think it sends that people don't care enough, right? People want their food, their animal flesh. They want it cheap. They want it readily available. They could care less how the animal's treated. And I think that gap, when people are in that state of they could care less, is a lot harder to bridge that gap to veganism than people care about the well-being of animals, but they just don't see that exploiting animals is also wrong.
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible that some people could think that, but it certainly is the case that the reason why people wouldn't vote for some sort of a welfare legislation is that they don't think it goes far enough, perhaps. So this is all speculation on both of our parts, but
100%, yeah, for sure.
Really quick, I think he's referring to your average meat eater, not the vegan that doesn't think it goes far enough, so they don't vote for it. I think what he's saying is, with your argument, if you just take a random person that eats meat just like regular people eat meat and they don't care about animals at all, your claim is that that person might see the law get passed and feel better about themselves. Go like, oh, okay, the food I want to eat is still here and this thing says animals are treated better. I feel better about myself. And then he's saying, well, what if it doesn't go through and that same person sees like, oh, they tried to pass some law for animals. It didn't go through.
Right. This must not matter. Right, the treatment of animals must not matter. So who cares? I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing, right? Because I think a lot of people's feelings about their morals and about what's happening in the world is dictated by the law, right? Especially kids, right? Because when kids grow up, right, they are following the law and they're basing a lot of their values on the law. So yeah, I'm not just. I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Carson, but yeah, I am talking about vegans and vegan activists, but also in general, yeah, I think the impact on the average meat or the average animal exploiter, when they see that these proposals aren't being passed, or when they see that there isn't support for this, a lot of people go, oh, so then it must not matter. Because they don't care to begin with. They're already exploiting the animals. I didn't need any welfare laws or anything to change my behavior, right? It's for the people who don't get it, right? The people who aren't just going to hear a good argument or see a good documentary and switch, right? It's people who are ignorant, people who are defensive, people who are reluctant to change, right? Those generations of people, it's going to be a generational change, which may be sparked with different laws being passed.
And
I mean,
also,
that
Eric, real quick, behind you, I think there's the 5-0. Is in your video, other side. It looks like a police officer across the street. But anyways, go on, Lewis.
Now, that certainly may be the case that people are that the average person may not care, or may see that since this welfare legislation didn't pass, that means that not enough people cared. But we already know, at least I think, that most people seem to care about cruelty to animals, right? Or certain types of cruelty. So to me, that indicates that there is some level of caring by most people. Now, certainly, it seems that that caring ends at a certain at a certain extent, for certain amounts of cruelty, because most people that I've seen, interviewed, and in my experience, they're like, oh, factory farming is terrible. Something should be done about it. So I think that people do care, and I think that we need to be a lot more nuanced about coming to a conclusion as to if legislation like some welfare legislation isn't passed, what does that mean to the average person? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what it might mean to the average person, being the fact that a lot of people do care at least about some types of cruelties and CAFOs and that kind of thing.
Really quick, just to push back a little bit, right? The people who you're talking about who do care about factory farming, right? Because I experienced the same thing. Well, I think factory farming is immoral, but it's fine to, eat animals, or it's fine to milk animals, whatever, right? In that regard, the only difference, right? Because our message is the same. Our message, when they say, oh yeah, something should be done about factory farming, our message isn't, oh, great job, yeah, that's all that matters, right? Our message is going to be the same. The only difference is if we don't support, because those people who say that something should be done about factory farming, they're not taking the matter into their own hands. They're not avoiding factory farm food. They're not avoiding factory farm leather, factory farm whatever. They're contributing to it. Those are the people who eat at McDonald's. Those are the people who care about animal cruelty. They contribute to the cruelty themselves, right? Almost always. I very rarely actually come across somebody who only hunts or who only buys from their local farm. So regardless, so if we have a law, right, that would, and again, it depends on the law, I agree with you, but let's say this law would significantly improve the well-being of factory farmed animals. Whether that law gets passed or not, the consumer is not going to change, right? That consumer who cares about animal cruelty is not going to, they're still going to eat the same stuff. They've already been eating it with all the cruelty, right? They're still eating it with all the footage being shown, with talking to a vegan activist. They're still contributing to the worst of the worst, right? So the best thing we can do, speculating, I think, would be to move that threshold to where we're just raising the standard, right? The bar is being raised legally. So that way, over time, the bar gets raised individually. I think that can be something that happens. So all I'm saying is, as a vegan, I'm not going to tear that branch. I'm not going to break that branch off the tree as a possible option, because I think it could actually influence a lot of people if we slowly raise the bar generationally, people's bar will also raise, right? I do think that could be an option. Pablo,
Real quick, I'll let anybody that wants to throw in any last thoughts go for it. We can stay on here another 10 minutes. I do got to hop off here like probably 10 minutes or less.
Cool.
So I just wanted to say real quick, everybody watching, thanks for watching. You guys being here, thanks for being here. Everybody's links to their channels will be in the description. Everybody should follow all these people, check out their stuff. You guys that are here, I know Brandon has a lot of people on his channel as guests to talk about stuff. So if you guys want to chat with him on his channel, you should message him about that. Pablo's channel is in Spanish, which I don't speak, but anybody that knows anybody that has any interest in the topic of veganism, animal rights, send links to Pablo's channel if they speak Spanish, and also there's subs there too. And then Brandon does a lot of street activism, talks to lots of people. I wish I could be as cool as Brandon, and I wish I could explain my own arguments as well as Brandon does. One of my favorite people to talk to. Lewis is one of my best friends, just all out. And if you go on any vegan YouTube channels, you will see him in the comments of every single YouTube video. And so you guys will probably keep running into Lewis. And great guy, thanks for being here. Eric makes documentaries. I'm not sure if he's in the middle of making any right now, but if you check out his channel, you'll see the various documentaries he made, and he goes all over doing all kinds of environmental stuff. Great guys. Everybody watching should follow their channels, subscribe, send them around. Even if we all slightly disagree on different things, we're all here for animals and to either end or cut down on suffering. But yeah, so I just wanted to say all that. And then, yeah, if anybody had any last things they wanted to throw out based on what other people have said, let's say them. But I got to end this and take my daughter out to my mom's house pretty soon. So yeah, go for it.
I wanted to make a comment. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, he froze.
I think he's letting you go.
Yeah. Oh, you muted yourself again. Pablo muted you.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Carson. And also I wanted to quickly say that I found that it was very brave from you and very honest what you did, I think some months ago when you said that you were starting to eat some products, even if you didn't want to, but you've found these health issues and so on. And I think it's counterproductive that people were sort of criticizing that, because at the end of the day, it can happen to all of us. I think there are always some solutions, but they may be more or less complicated. And, you know, if you get some kind of disease and you have to be taking some medicines, those may have been tested on animals and there is little you can do. And unfortunately, our society is not providing for us the alternatives that we would want to have. So I think infighting is very bad. And I think it's good to be brave, to be honest about it. And again, let's think about strategy. We should not criticize each other for not being 100% vegan if you are like 99%. Like, I think that's just a waste of time. So we should focus our efforts on the most effective strategies to reduce animal suffering. So thanks a lot for hosting.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you. Eric, did you have some thoughts?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly address Brandon's comment about reading the bar.
Oh, wait, hold on. Start over. There's some issue with the sound.
Okay, I was saying I would like to address the last comment Brandon made about raising the bar and the concept of animal welfare as a path to animal liberation. I see it as a slightly different thing. I see it as the exploiters are always moving the goalpost. So no matter how high we raise our bar, the exploiters will always move the goalpost and will never reach it, which is why I believe that we're all basically saying the same thing: stop exploiting animals. And what I wanted to say about that is, Carson, by the way, thank you. I love this conversation. This is exactly what vegans need to be having, because we have grown into the most diverse group, but we all have one common goal. And this is an exact example of that. But again, I would like to really thank everybody for opening so many different realms of thought and conversation today, because the only way we're going to change and move in the future is through conversation and through getting to understand each other, building walls. Building bridges, not walls. Too many walls, too many walls. We need to build bridges. We need to understand where we're coming from and understand how each other's causes and movements can help each other's end goals. And I think we're all one big army fighting for a better future. We do have some slight disagreements on if animal welfare will help or hinder the animal rights ultimately. But that was an amazing conversation today to get to talk about that. So I just want to thank everybody today for this beautiful conversation. So much to think about. I do remain in my camp, animal rights, animal liberation without compromise.
Awesome. And really quick, just on something Pablo said about infighting. Yeah, infighting bad, in debating good. We should always be challenging each other, throwing out ideas. We don't have to agree on everything. But we should keep in mind when non-vegans or just people that are so far from vegan look at us that we aren't making them go like, fuck that, I want out of there. We don't want them to go like, they can't even, So yeah, we should always challenge each other, always have debates. But yeah, the kind of stuff of like, oh, if you do this, you're not vegan. The amount of people I see say like Joaquin Phoenix is the worst person of the year because he rode a horse, even though he's completely vegan by diet. He's probably the most famous person spreading the word of going vegan, no using of animal products whatsoever. But he decided to ride a horse in a movie. Let's not make ourselves look so crazy while having different opinions.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. Lewis or Brandon, and do you guys have any last thoughts before I close it down?
Yeah, I'll let Lewis end, but yeah, no, it was a good talk. It's a breath of fresh air to actually debate ideas and concepts with vegans, so that's cool. I think I missed what Pablo said because I had to use the bathroom for like the fourth time, but yeah, I just you have no idea how many people I see, or how many vegans, quote unquote, who will comment criticism, and when I actually ask them, hey, come on the channel, let's debate, and there a lot of these criticisms, they're evidence-based claims, right? So, well, single-issue campaigns don't do anything, or, well, this tactic doesn't do anything. Things that require evidence. You have no idea how many people I'll actually ask to come on the channel, and they say, oh, no, I don't debate, or no, this isn't up for discussion. It's like, okay, well, I think that as vegans, right? I think veganism, right, the rejection of animal exploitation is one thing, but I think it's also important for us to be honest and intelligent and logically consistent, not to tag my name there, but I think it's very important because education and that's the stuff that wins, right? Those are the things that cause change, not just some dogmatic, arbitrary position, right? It's got to be well thought out, well communicated, and by discussing things, by actually wanting to better our position, that's how we get there, I think. So yeah, it was great conversation. I again firm on the camp of unless we know for sure that something doesn't work, let's use every tool we have in our tool bag. Let's any type of win for the individual victims who can't speak for themselves. This would be easy conversation if animals could say, hey, we want this, we don't want that, like in the human context, but they can't, unfortunately. So until we have that technology, any kind of win or instrumental change we can get, I think is a positive. And yeah, hopefully we'll see something big in our lifetime change. So I'm excited for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the real reason why Brandon had to go to the bathroom 4 times in just one small stream is because he's vegan, of course. Jokes aside, no, this is a good conversation. I agree with Eric when he pointed out that open dialogue is crucial. I couldn't agree more with that. I think we probably all agree with that. And so yeah, I think that we and the way we had it today, I think was. I would say that this should be an example of how people who have differing ideas. Now, maybe we don't have greatly differing ideas, but still, we did have differences. And this seems to be an example of a good way to conduct a conversation where we're respectful of each other. We're asking questions of each other. So I really thought this was excellent. So thank you for hosting this, Carson.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Okay. Well, you guys have a great day, and I'm sure I'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
everybody.
Yep.
See you.
Take
Thanks,
care, my
everyone.
friends.